1998, 2004, 2007, 2017. The consensus has declared these years to be video games' finest. 4 moments in time that achieved perfect convergence between the quality and the quantity of newly released video games. Everybody has their favorites, of course. I'm personally quite fond of both 2010 and 2019 myself. But if we're keeping it purely scientific, and you know that's what we do here, then the winners are pretty obvious. Though, word has been going around lately. It sounds as if the greater video game community is looking to carve a 5th head into their metaphorical Mount Rushmore. 2023 has come and gone, but as I write this introduction over half a year later, it's clear that we as a society have not moved on. The industry is still living in last year's shadow, and it will likely remain there until Grand Theft Auto 6 raptures half of the total US workforce. My question is, as someone who believes that the last 5 years, and that would be 2019 to 2023, has been something of a modern renaissance for the medium, does 2023 really stand out amongst the crowd? Hi, my name is Caleb Kirkland, and what once started as my Cliff's Notes for a much smaller Game of the Year discussion has instead ballooned into the nightmarish titan before you. I've brought with me a total of 13 games of varying reception that I wish to discuss for equally varying lengths of time. These are the games released in the year 2023 that I loved, that I hated, and that I was so indifferent towards that I figured that was probably worth talking about too. Let's get ready to drop right into our first game of the evening, one that is actually responsible for kickstarting this entire journey to begin with.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can.
Insomniac's first take at Spidey may have secured them a top spot on my list back in 2018, but despite doubling the number of playable characters, explorable burrows, and total development budget, they've somehow delivered an experience with half the charm. Before I swing into it, I want to make it clear that while Marvel's Spider-Man 2 may not be patient zero of the $70 video game epidemic, it is one of the best examples to point at when discussing the double-sided financial burden of modern prestige video games. Therefore, in the pursuit of fairness, I will be applying an additional $10 worth of scrutiny towards the game in order to ask and answer whether Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is $10 better than the original. Actually, scratch that, we can do better. In 2020, Insomniac released Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales, a game that, while shorter in length, felt like a far more substantial leap forward content-wise than the preceding full-fledged sequel, and it did so at a reduced price of $50. So really my question should be, is Marvel's Spider-Man 2 $20 better than Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales? To put it bluntly, no. It's bigger, but it functions largely the same. It presents largely the same, and yet it somehow feels more burdensome to play. Sure, the game's able to move at a much quicker pace, and ray tracing has been freed from Fidelity Mode Prison, but outside of the technical improvements afforded by new hardware, mechanically, the game feels like an awkward combining of what already existed within the prior 2 releases, a Sonic 3 and Knucklesing of the Spider-Man duology, but without the fun plastic docking bit. It's the same 2 characters, swinging around the same city, with roughly the same kits, the same tired puzzle segments, the same prestige walkie-talkie sections, and an extra heaping of the atrocious Mary Jane stealth missions. At best, it feels like a game that was made in a vacuum with no access to the criticisms given on the previous games. And at worst, it could come off as an intentional doubling down on all of the things Insomniac already knew people didn't like about the original, supported by both the volume of these particular sections and the newfound inability to skip them. I've played through Spider-Man 2018 maybe 5 times at this point, and I've always found it to be a pleasant experience to revisit. Even without mentioning things like New Game Plus and the slew of available difficulty options, it flows extremely well on a vanilla playthrough. I can skip most of the sections that would otherwise grind the pacing to a halt, and the narrative is so surprisingly well crafted for a superhero game that it's easy to get reinvested in despite knowing the moment-to-moment beats. It became something of a comfort game for me, and remains so all these years later. Marvel's Spider-Man 2, however, despite my criticisms of its indistinguishable similarities, feels like a complete inversion of the original game's vibe. It's a hassle, it's occasionally hostile, and as a result, it's a game that I don't think I'd ever want to play again unless substantial patches were added to skip entire sections and I had full character unlocks from the start. And even with all of that, I would definitely be skipping the plot. The symbiote suit makes Peter insufferable by design for most of the game. Insomniac's portrayal of Mary Jane, who has always been insufferable by design, has now been ramped up to 11, making Scott Pilgrim's relationship with Ramona Flowers seem like a fairy tale by comparison. Kraven is nowhere near as interesting as Otto Octavius or Martin Lee because he completely lacks the believable human element and the personal connection to the protagonists. Contrary to popular belief, quote, dying of cancer, end quote, doesn't automatically make an audience empathize with a murderous psychopath. He's doing it for sport. He's not even killing billionaires. Kraven also falls victim to the Raimi Spider-Man 3 conundrum, where you've crammed so many villains into one story that none of them are able to shine on their own. Honestly, the heroes are facing a similar problem themselves, and there's only 2 of them. Miles has it by far the worst, being treated as an afterthought in the game's narrative, only to then suddenly be thrown into frame as the proverbial personified mulligan to clean up all of Peter's messes. Everything about the narrative is just off. It's messy, it's bloated, it's disjointed, it's just an all-around bummer of a time. I'm afraid my complaints do not end with narrative and pacing, however, as I've encountered several gameplay grievances that further hinder my enjoyment. While web swinging has been dramatically improved with lightning-fast traversal speeds and assist options that can be disabled for more challenging control, swinging has been undermined by the addition of web wings. On their own, web wings are a fun, Knuckles the Echidna-esque glide function that lets Spider-Man weave between tight spaces and cross large, barren stretches of land. Though by passing through the horribly distracting air tunnels placed throughout the city, the player can effectively achieve full, unfettered Superman flight, rendering swinging completely obsolete. I'd like to see some assist options added in for web wings that lets the player tweak the rate of descent alongside the intensity or density of these scattered air tunnels. Anything that increases the margin of error and gives traversal some weight, in every sense of the word. That said, there's still some slight adjustments that could also be made to swinging before it's done and dusted. While this is definitely nitpicky and probably just as hard to implement as it is to illustrate, I kept finding myself in situations where I would cancel different actions into a swing or attach a web to a surface at just a slightly off angle, and both of my Spider-Man would just awkwardly hitch and lose all of their momentum out of nowhere. It's not the end of the world, especially considering how quickly the player can hit top speed, but swinging is the most single important verb in a Spider-Man game, so if there was anything I would expect to be perfect and pristine, it would probably be that. I think combat has stumbled backwards in a few ways too. As you often see with sequels like these, Spider-Man 2 has upped the enemy density per combat encounter pretty dramatically, turning what would once be a 2-minute brawl into a tumultuous, overly defensive game of red light, green light. Peter and Miles pull their punches way too much in this game, and it makes finishing off enemies an absolute chore. Your combos are long, enemies are durable, and some baddies require very specific methods to apprehend. But due to the sheer number of units on screen at any given time, you're going to find yourself constantly and purposefully dropping your combos in order to react to your Spidey sense. Your webs and cooldowns are more vital than ever, as they maintain their ability to instantly incapacitate lesser threats, but until you've made considerable progress through your character unlocks, agony awaits you in resource famine. One of my big criticisms of the Miles Morales standalone game was that Miles' kit didn't ever feel expressive as Peter's did in the first game. Being a tinkerer with a lot of commandeered tech, Peter utilized several homemade gadgets in combat. I adored using web tethers, electric webs, and impact webbing in conjunction with Pete's contextual fisticuffs. I know we've long mocked this sentiment, but it really sold the Spider-Man fantasy of being fluid, improvisational, and precise, rather than just plowing your fists through every single problem. I had hoped that Spider-Man 2 would build upon the gadget system for Peter and use it to further distinguish the two protagonists from one another. Miles wielding his bioelectricity to steamroll enemies on the front line, while Peter is using his wisdom and finesse to outwit opponents from the shadows. But instead, Peter's symbiote powers just end up mirroring Miles' venom powers, which, by the way, is not confusing nomenclature in the slightest. And as a result, the two Spider-Men just kind of feel like echo fighters of one another. This also leads me into probably my biggest point of contention with Marvel's Spider-Man 2, and it's one that bleeds out into the larger video game space: character progression. I first have to wonder, why do Peter and Miles have fully separate unlock trees when their kits are so similar to one another? Why do they have separate unlock trees when there's only one non-gadget related unlock currency that is acquired and shared by and between both characters? Why do they have separate unlock trees when there's also a third combined skill tree that consists of shared abilities? Doesn't that just kind of seem needlessly complicated? I feel like I need a PhD to parse menus in big budget games nowadays. You didn't ask, but my ideal type of progression, at least for an action game like this one, would be a lot more intrinsic, focused on the player's growth rather than the character's growth. I want the challenges within the world and the world itself to evolve to encourage experimentation with and mastery of my toolset, not for the toolset to be slowly breadcrumbed to me after an arbitrary amount of side content has been complete, though I don't expect this terrible trend to stop anytime soon. At the very least, games that include New Game Plus options should stop gatekeeping them. Let the player pick New Game Plus right from the start. It's not like most people finish video games anyway, at least statistically speaking. This at least gives those players an opportunity to experience the best moments before shelving the game forever. In conclusion, if you've played the original Marvel's Spider-Man, you have a pretty good idea of what you're getting into. If you're a massive Spider-Man fan, there are probably worse ways to spend a weekend. Though if the direction taken in the Miles Morales standalone release had raised any red flags for you, maybe consider setting your expectations for Spider-Man 2 appropriately. Anyway, the moral of the story is that AAA games are too expensive, not only to buy, but to make. And the Sony tax, or whatever we're going to call it in the broader scope, does not seem like it's improving the games, the quality of life for the developers, or even helping to offset the absurd budgets these things are gobbling up. And frankly, I think you've got to be pretty gullible to have ever expected otherwise. Though I don't celebrate the circumstances from which a lot of this information was revealed, we know that Marvel's Spider-Man 2 has been struggling to meet expectations despite hitting numbers that, for anything else, would be considered a slam dunk. I'm really trying to avoid using any combination of the words power and responsibility in my closing statement, but it's really important to recognize that regardless of where this industry ends up, the blame falls almost entirely on us. It's pretty clear that Sony's tentative solution to hemorrhaging money is to push retail pricing to its absolute limit, and to offer games in portions. The question is, do we, as consumers, have the self-restraint and patience necessary to starve out poor practices early, or are we just going to continue shifting blame and saving face on Twitter until it's too late? Uncle Ben would not be playing gotchas. That's all I'm saying. Having a fighting game on my list makes me feel weird and icky. It almost feels like I'm doing something criminal. How can I, someone who has lost to literal children in both Soul Calibur and Marvel vs. Capcom 3, ever speak on a fighting game with any level of authority? I can't, but I can talk about it from an accessibility point of view and share the ways in which Street Fighter VI in particular both builds me up and tears me down. Though first, how about a little background? I've had this weird quirk for the last 3 console generations where I just buy fighting games, fully intending to never play them. This habit was initially developed, I can only assume, because back in the day, fighting games were something of an endangered species. I always felt like my $60 could be the difference between them existing or not, and I couldn't have Sakura's death on my conscience. I've always admired fighting games, ever since I saw my first Marvel 2 cabinet in the wild, but I've preferred to love them from a distance. 1, because I value the concept of personal hygiene, and 2, because they require a specific level of dedication and trial and error that would make me miserable in practice. My frustration with fighting games has always stemmed from an inability to carve a path to moderate success through intuition alone. Not to say that it can't be done, but I certainly can't do it, not as the person I am writing this today. Once I acknowledged that, I began to see fighting games as sort of adjacent to the rest of video games. There's a lot of overlap, of course, but I compare it to the difference between cooking and baking, whereas the former leaves room for experimentation and improvisation, while the latter begs for meticulousness and consistency. And once something begins to feel like self-imposed homework, I lose the drive to stay engaged. Like Diablo, Street Fighter VI was another title that probably would have fallen to the wayside had it not been for the partial graciousness of a friend. I say partial because his decision to purchase the game for me was almost assuredly fueled by a desire to observe and prod me like some sort of virgin pure test subject. Fortunately for the both of us, I do live for that shit. Deciding which character I wanted to play was pretty easy. I knew I wanted someone who wasn't super technical and who could best capitalize off of my coin flippy approach to strategy, so naturally, I ended up with the worst character in the game. Through sheer force of will, I played 20 plus hours, hellbent on learning the game with classic controls. I got pretty good at using Geef's karate chop target combo, and specifically full screen running bear grabs. Once I could execute a level 3 with 50% accuracy, I made the change to modern controls for research purposes. And with this newfound power, I could send every kin player back to the Elmer's glue factory they came from. And I did so, all the way to Platinum. And then I celebrated by uninstalling the game. But you know what? I got a solid 40 hours out of Street Fighter VI before I hit a hard wall. And that was more than enough for me. I knew I was never going to sit in training mode with Geef. I was never going to look up combo videos or watch replays or stop complaining that Lariat didn't hit behind me. I was just going to see how far my intuition and coin-flipping aerial SPDs could get me, and I had a really good time doing it. The in-game tutorial is competent enough, I would say. The single-player options are plentiful, even if I don't love the Sonic Battle-esque World Tour mode. The avatar customization is completely unnecessary, but super hilarious. The balance might even probably be mostly okay. And modern controls were actually a really good and well-implemented idea, much to my surprise. Ultimately, I'm not the type of person who could or should ever write any in-depth review on how this game is in any competitive sense, so I don't have any scathing critiques for the game itself, nor will I discuss characters on a granular level. But as a baby casual, I hope I can still offer some valuable insight. If I was going to say anything, I think it would be more genre-wide. I think fighting games can still do a lot more work to bridge the knowledge gap for new players. And while I'd never suggest an outright softening of edges or anything like that, I think the educational tools can always be further improved to not only teach you how to do combo, but how to handle certain blanket situations, how to properly execute complicated inputs, maybe some basic matchup advice, helping players comprehend frame data, etc., and maybe packaged in a more palatable and engaging way rather than just being a shotgun blast of menu toggles. Basically, any way that unfamiliar players can decipher this language internally rather than fleeing to YouTube or Discord and hoping that they can convey their questions with their own spotty terminology. But for what it's worth, I think fighting games are getting there step by step, and I do acknowledge the inherent social aspect to these games, as well as their tendency to evolve once adopted by the players. Basically, all that to say, I'm very aware of how hard that would actually be to solve. I'll always have my own bias and personal hangups that irk me about Street Fighter VI. I'll always wish that I lived in a world where zoners and rushdown archetypes didn't feel so brain-dead and oppressive, but counterpoint, me Zangief. I'll always wish Lily had retained her concept art design and had more than one neat combo that doctors hate. Maybe then I would have gone with her instead of the big guy. I'll always wish my matches didn't devolve into someone walking backwards and throwing fireballs at me. I'll always wish I didn't have to internalize frame data to know when I can throw a jab when Kin is mashing buttons with his feet. And I will always wish that Lariat fucking hit behind me. But I'm big enough to admit that I'm just bad at these things. I didn't grow up with him that way. I didn't grow up with them. I can't necessarily blame Capcom or any of these other games for the concept of a language barrier, and I can't fully criticize a fighting game without criticizing myself, which clearly there's a lot to criticize. But as far as Street Fighter VI goes, it's the closest I've ever been to being a part of this larger thing that has always felt so impenetrable and incomprehensible. And even though I've taken a step away from it, it sticks with me in a way that even Skullgirls and Strive couldn't fully achieve. I want to go back. At least I think I want to go back. I definitely want to go back. And depending on where future seasons take the game, I very well may. But until that happens, I'm just proud to say that MyGeef made it to Platinum without a single combo to our name. And I have photographic and in-game statistical evidence that at least 2 people rage quit mid-SPD. If that's not the most fun you can have without a cash reward, I don't know what is. Maybe there is hope for me after all. Complex, winding narratives, bodaciously bold presentation, gameplay decisions that can only be described as very European. These are the tried and true ingredients of a Remedy Entertainment production. The beloved Finnish studio responsible for the creation of industry icon Max Payne. As a systems and performance-minded individual, it is in my nature to clash with Remedy's storyteller-first philosophy. I have a ton of respect for the studio and their dedication to pushing the boundaries of narrative in an interactive medium. But if I'm being honest, I've just not been fully impressed with the video game aspects from their thin catalog of titles. Max Payne was a relic of its time, and one that I unfortunately experienced far too late. It's simple, it's repetitive, and if not for its signature wax poeticism in conjunction with the existence of bullet time, I think it would have evaporated entirely from my memory. There's Quantum Break, which I honestly can't even talk about without being way too mean for comfort. It's sort of the quintessential Xbox One product, which alone should paint you a perfect picture of just how miserable it really is. Control is probably their best concept in game to date, but it still feels buried beneath layers of frustration. Things like long load times and rough performance, an abysmal checkpoint system, grueling boss encounter design, and one of the worst upgrade systems I've probably ever seen in a video game. But then there's Alan Wake. Turns out a game that puts you in the shoes of an artsy, egomaniacal crime novelist really plays to the strengths of Remedy's heavy-handed themes and flowery prose. Like Max Payne, I've long criticized the first Alan Wake for getting too repetitive too quick. I never really felt like the light mechanic or the overall approach to combat ever evolved beyond its starting point, and the in-between traversal segments were largely leisurely strolls through deceptively linear forest environments. It was easy to spot the Max Payne DNA. But despite all this, Alan Wake was the first and only Remedy game to really strike a chord with me. For years it has sat comfortably beside the likes of Nier Gestalt, Lollipop Chainsaw, and Dragon's Dogma at the 7th generation's table of 7 out of 10s. And despite an ongoing, ever-increasing saturation of the survival horror genre, a dramatic shift in the video game landscape, and a decade of near silence, I was always eager for Alan's return. Alan Wake 2 would launch in late October of 2023 to a world deep in the midst of a survival horror renaissance. The game would take great inspiration from not only Control's success, but the ongoing Resident Evil remake series, dropping the more straightforward action of the original Alan Wake for a much more dense, neo-traditional survival horror experience. While it would be very easy to mistake AW2 for a modern Resident Evil at a glance, Alan Wake 2's pseudo-open world, reality-shifting systems, and oppressive narrative are sure to distinguish where visuals may not. Even knowing ahead of time that Alan Wake 2 was going to shift more heavily into horror territory, it's still incredibly jarring just how severe the swerve really is. The superficial similarities remain, but these are wildly different games with wildly different tones. Gameplay-wise, Alan is no longer the straight-shooting action hero of the 2010s. He's a slightly more competent than average horror protagonist of today, boasting a traditional, mostly tolerable, some would even say necessary for the genre, kind of stiffness and sluggishness in his actions and movement. He's also gained quite the affinity for puzzles in his older age. And while the game does sprinkle Remedy's signature campy humor throughout, I can't help but feel like the sequel has lost some of the, persistent lightheartedness of the original, which makes sense given the genre shift and narrative circumstances, but it's one of the many things that makes this feel more like a sequel to Control rather than to Alan Wake. And I guess that's because it technically is. In order to fully appreciate Alan Wake 2, it is heavily encouraged, if not suggested, that you have previous knowledge of Alan Wake, Control and its expansions, the existence of Quantum Break, the character of Max Payne, as well as who actually owns all of these different intellectual properties in the real world. This is because, as of the AWE expansion for Control, the entirety of the Remedy catalog has been officially hamburgered together into a singular universe of cinematic proportions. I wouldn't sweat it too much, though. The plot is pretty much just as indigestible whether you're loaded with the complete context or not. As long as you know who Sam Lake is, you're probably going to be okay. It just feels kinda weird that they decided to break the seal of their strange IP orgy on a sequel to a standalone thing, of which people have been waiting like over a decade for. But maybe I'm just too sensitive to change. After all, I'm not even sure we'd have an Alan Wake 2 to talk about if it wasn't for Control, so maybe I should be grateful. However, I like begging and choosing. Alan Wake is still stuck in the dark place. He's been writing every conceivable story that hits his brain, hoping that one of them will jar him from his eternal nightmare. But the dark place is picky. It has affixed a laundry list of restrictions and limitations on what it deems acceptable storytelling. It must be a horror story. It has to be comprehensive and believable. And most importantly, it has to be good. Otherwise, it will be rejected like all the rest. Though each successive failure breeds further insight as to the quenchless demands of the dark place. Alan is getting closer, but he's only capable of so much from within the abyss. He's not a hero, after all. He's a victim in this story, a demi-soi of darkness. He needs someone to save him. Alan Wake 2 officially introduces the character of Saga Anderson, an FBI agent who wields the power of controlled telepathic communication. She and her partner, Alex Casey, who you might have known as one Max Payne prior to certain real-life legal circumstances, have been dispatched to the town of Bright Falls, Washington, in order to lead an investigation on a series of local cult-led murders. Though things quickly escalate after the discovery of one of Alan Wake's lost manuscript pages off the shore of Cauldron Lake. The murders, the investigation, this was all a part of his story. What follows is an even narrative split between the differing perspectives of our dual protagonists. Saga utilizes her supernatural sleuthing skills on the surface world, while Alan desperately drafts new realities from within the depths of his dark prison. Though separate, they work towards the same goal of putting an end to this nightmare by any means necessary. Being separated by space and time, the player is free to choose the order in which they experience the characters' stories, with the only caveats being the first and final chapters. Should you decide to burn through one route at a time or ping pong back and forth at an even pace, it's completely your call. Though it's important to note that you will be barred from the game's conclusion until you've fully completed both Saga and Alan's paths. They are two halves of a whole. The moment-to-moment gameplay remains largely consistent between both characters. Scrounge and hoard your precious resources, solve both environmental puzzles and written riddles, and most importantly, blast away creeps with your trusty firearms. Pretty straightforward survival horror game flavors, most of which are familiar to anyone coming over from the first game. Though in order to meet the expectations of the modern landscape, achieve a more unified style with control, and to simply flex their technical chops, Alan Wake 2 has seen some significant changes over the original for both better and for worse. The first thing you're probably going to notice is how large the environments have become. It's not quite the open world fantasy that Remedy had originally intended for Alan Wake, and I honestly wouldn't want it to be. But there are still massive zones that can house multiple key areas at a time. This 2D map right here isn't exactly great for showing scale, but it does provide a good example of just how many major set pieces can exist within a single defined space. Even key interior zones like the hotel are accessible via the quote open world without any sort of noticeable transition or loading barrier. And you can freely backtrack in and out and all around without issue. It's really impressive. Naturally, having access to all that space means having to actually do something with it. I'm happy to report that traditional quests are out in favor of things like cache riddles, environment puzzles, and optional areas containing collectibles or additional items, though the persistent threat of enemies means that you'll need to carefully evaluate your status and decide whether that risk is worth the potential reward. It's a much welcome, hands-off approach to exploration, prioritizing wanderlust over chorelust. Some findings may even unlock the potential to power up your characters. Specifically, scavenged manuscript fragments can be traded for weapon upgrades for Saga, while Alan can ascribe newfound words of power to himself, enhancing his own abilities. Some are a bit more valuable than others, but the game does a fairly good job of making your power-up options more substantial than a minor percentage increase of something, for example. Even the most basic magazine size upgrade increases your capacity by a whopping 50%, but as a result, they're quite expensive, and the resources needed are equally as scarce. After discussing with folk online, by which I mean typing my question verbatim into a search engine, I can confirm that it is not possible to acquire every single upgrade in the game. In fact, it sounds like you won't get anywhere near a fully powered up arsenal for either character. And though I agree with this decision for Alan Wake 2 specifically, I think games that opt to go down this route should always explicitly mention that fact before asking anyone to invest in their upgrade systems. So, minor point deduction on that front. While Light has maintained a crucial role as both a narrative device and a gameplay system, it has largely been rejiggered in terms of the latter. Streetlights and log cabins still offer themselves as safe havens against the darkness, though no longer yield healing properties to anyone beyond a critical status. They instead act as deterrents, removing the player from an enemy's line of sight so long as they do not initiate combat from within the confines. Since it's not something that I ever felt the need to take advantage of myself, I'd consider it a downgrade by comparison to it being this burst of life in the original Alan Wake. Though as liberal as Alan Wake 2 tends to be with tossing you health items, leaving it as it originally had been would have been overkill. In terms of its combat application, Light serves the same purpose as it always has. Your flashlight is still necessary to burn away the outer layer of darkness oozing from enemies, though in the previous games, you had a lot more control over the resource expenditure. Instead of operating on a recharging meter, your flashlight now depletes one full battery pip each time you focus. To make up for this, instead of slowly draining an enemy's shield over a few seconds, it's now a near instantaneous pop. It's important to note that pips do not recharge on their own, nor is your flashlight still capable of passively damaging shields, meaning batteries are no longer a luxury, but a necessity. And I don't know about you, but this seems like a huge overcorrection to me. Sure, resource management was a non-issue in Alan Wake 1, especially in terms of the recharging batteries, but the fun and the tension of using a flashlight is that uncertainty. Asking yourself, can I manage this meter well enough to stun all of these enemies in time and without having to swap out batteries? That kinda was the draw to the original game's combat. IMO, there are many better ways to solve this problem that don't involve gunifying the flashlight, so I'm really confused why this was the route they chose. That said, since it is somewhat harder to overstock on items now, you no longer start from zero on subsequent chapters as you would in the first game. Thank God there's some silver lining. All of your resources, while character specific, are persistent and can even be stored in an item box within safe havens for your complete hoarding pleasure, thus completing the series' full migration into the survival horror genre. Congratulations. To reiterate, Alan and Saga do share a similar moment-to-moment gameplay loop, though their individual routes are built around major, ever-present systems that remain unique to one over the other. Flipping the script this time, let's start with Alan's fresh batch of reality-shifting superpowers. Similarly to myself at the exact moment of writing this, Alan is actively drafting and tweaking his story as he moves through it. You're experiencing a work in progress. As such, you're likely to find yourself at a half-baked or dead-end idea with nowhere to go. However, either by mind palacing or astral projecting, Alan is able to return to the writer's room with the press of a button, where he can then select new plot elements via the plot board. Doing so will, upon returning to Alan's story, alter the surrounding area to better fit Alan's new narrative. In gameplay terms, this usually means changing the dominant color of an area and shifting around some furniture, obstacles, or walls to create a new path forward. It's simple, but it's very effective as both a puzzle mechanic and a way to visually shake up environments in a way that feels like it was the player's choice to do so, though it's restricted to individual key areas and not applied globally, so please don't get your hopes up for 6 different iterations of the entire game world. This is not that. Keeping in theme with spatial manipulation, Alan's other new tool is the Angel Lamp. This object of power is capable of plucking raw light from specific environmental sources and storing it within the lamp itself. Inversely, it can also expend any of its stored light charges to illuminate said specific environmental sources, indicated by a flickering light. Okay, let's just cut the shit. This is basically the same mechanic as the plot board, just a bit more instantaneous and not packaged with narration. I'm not truly aware of the reasoning given, if any, that explains why light works this way in this specific context. I suppose it could just be an effect of the Angel Lamp exclusively, but then I also wonder why it's only usable on certain lights to begin with. I don't know, and honestly, I don't even really care. I don't think the devs did either. The first few times I utilized the Angel Lamp, I was under the impression that managing my stored light was going to play a bigger part in forward progress. I thought I would have to keep a mental note of where I had used my charges so that I could circle back, retrieve them, and use them elsewhere. Kind of like the glyph trials in Final Fantasy X, but on a much larger scale, more persistent and, maybe not terrible this time. But that dream was dashed after I realized how easy it was to just steal my charge back through the other side of an obstacle. To use my favorite metaphor format, it's the video game equivalent of tying a string to a quarter and yanking it back out of the coin slot. I ended up carrying the maximum amount of charges at all times as a result, and without the management aspect, there is no puzzle, there is no obstacle. The mechanic completely falls apart, and I'm afraid that Saga does not fare much better. Saga doesn't share any directly comparable abilities with Alan, as she's largely isolated to the surface world and lacks any significant influence over it. Instead, she retreats into her mind, wherein she can categorize, telepathize, and tangibilize any pertinent information. This is the Mind Place, Saga's version of the Mind Palace technique. Similarly to Alan's writer's room, the Mind Place acts as your interactive start menu, housing your collectibles, upgrades, save feature, and so on. But the e-ticket attractions are as follows. The first is profiling. Now, I can only really describe this to the best of my own interpretation, so please take the narrative specifics with a healthy grain of skepticism. To my understanding, this is Saga effectively tapping into a key character's subconscious in order to interrogate it for information. There are some special cases that follow their own logic, but for the most part, this seems to be correct within the margin of error. This is really just a dialogue tool, as you might expect though, and it is a mandatory feature as interactions within act as event triggers, barring you from certain progress. It's fine. Like most everything else, it's not really interactive. It's definitely not LA Noire. You're really just exhausting all of your available options until the game gives you the information you need to move forward, which plays directly into the star attraction of the Mind Place, which is the case board. When this system was first introduced, I was under the impression that it was going to act similarly to a real case board in real life. Crazy theory, I know. I expected that my actions, be it exploration, interrogation, or what have you, would present physical clues or evidence pertaining to the murder case at hand, or to a series of different cases down the line. I assumed these would have to be thoughtfully and manually pieced together onto the board in order for the player to uncover information to help guide them forward. What we got instead was a semi-automatic catalog of story events that occasionally and quietly became a mandatory manual event trigger. Let me paint you a more detailed image using a real-life example that I encountered. I had played several hours of the game without having to interact with the caseboard much at all. I had quickly learned that it would eventually auto-categorize information beyond a certain threshold so that the player wouldn't be welcomed to a queue of 100+ outdated clues to sift through. Because I'm partially literate, I was able to use verbal cues and context clues to navigate myself to the next in-game objective, though once I got to the appropriate destination, I found that there was no prompt. Now, I had experienced a similar bug several times before this point, where button prompts just completely failed to populate at crucial events. We'll get into that later. So I assumed it was another one of those scenarios, but relaunching the game did not fix it. Loading a previous save and retracing my steps did not fix it. I ended up meandering around this place for longer than I'd like to admit, completely baffled as to why I could not figure out what was going on. I ended up hopping online to see if I had missed some sort of prerequisite or if other people had encountered a similar issue. Lo and behold, turns out there were several other people sharing similar reports about being unable to progress beyond this specific point. One helpful forum user was able to clarify that the prompt wouldn't actually populate until you pieced together each of the necessary events that would lead to it. In other words, the player knew the solution, but the character didn't. This was pretty much the final nail in the coffin for me. Had it not been Alan Wake, I think I would have parted ways with the game at this point. None of the new systems felt fully baked. The game was riddled with several documented soft locks, subtitle errors, performance hitches, and even a memory leak. So to throw in inconsistent rules and a disregard for both the player's time and intelligence, I just had nothing left to fuel my desire. And even reliving the experience now in writing form, I have no desire to continue talking about this game. It's a bit ironic that in a game quite literally about the iterative creative process, that its developers would seemingly opt for the first draft of every idea they conceived. The desire to enhance and improve is obvious, but the execution just is not there. The game is somehow overcomplicated in the strangest of spots, but the solutions to most problems remain simply the same. I'm several months removed and several months researched from my first and only playthrough, and there are still mechanics that I don't remotely understand. Like, what's the fucking deal with these apparitions? Sometimes they materialize into tangible threats, but sometimes they just evaporate into the ether. I've tried identifying any sort of visual or audio-based tell, but as far as I know, it's just completely random. And it drives me absolutely insane to not know. If it is random and the intended effect was tension and mystery, I'm afraid to say that they've instead struck a double helping of frustration. I really don't want to sound cruel, but the experience was such a drag. There's nice imagery, there's nice tunes, there's really solid atmosphere all around, but my god, it's such a technical and mechanical nightmare. And even narratively, it feels like we've ended on the same note that we started on. It's horribly dissatisfying. And not that it's all that significant, I guess, but you can't even access the game's true ending without completing a second playthrough of the game. In what universe would I ever want to slog through this narrative-heavy experience a second time? It sucks to wait 13 years for something. People like to blame unrealistic expectations as if it's some sort of failing of the consumer, but in my case, I just wanted something that resembled the game I played in 2010, maybe with some thoughtful tweaks and a new system or two, but everything always has to be bigger and more complicated, lest you have your artist privileges revoked by non-creatives on the internet. It's worse than Control, even with improvements to load times and power-ups. It's worse than the cornucopious survival horror contemporaries that can be acquired for a fraction of the price and storage space. It's worse than Kingdom Hearts in terms of offering satisfying narrative punctuation in a convoluted, ham-fisted multiverse series about the battle between light and darkness, though it will be unjustly revered for simply having a catchy musical number. Because in the words of one Andre 3000, quote, "Y'all don't want to hear me, you just want to dance."
So you were drawn to stories early on. My dreams would light up my imagination. And you had nightmares night and day. Yeah, but with the clicker, I chased those frights away.
I think my days of competitive gaming are largely over. Between ever-increasing responsibilities and a compounding backlog, I just find it difficult to burn all of my free time grinding in a game that has no endpoint and could very easily just up and vanish from existence without warning. I already lost the only good Splatoon game to time. I'm not so quick to love again. Though I have enjoyed my reduced cortisol levels, I am unfortunately a product of my environment. I'm in a near constant state of craving shooters, specifically arena shooters and anything that resembles them. I want to shoot fast and move even quicker, and a guy can only play the early access version of Ultra Kill so many times before it's gotta go into the Disney Vault. But even with that, single-player campaigns can only scratch so much of that itch. They're often too restrictive, too repetitive, or just too short to satisfy. I've always wanted something with the longevity and unpredictability of a multiplayer space, but that can also be in a relaxing, isolated, single-player environment. Something that could be done with my hands whilst blasting through my weekly podcasts. And since Bungie screwed the pooch on that fantasy, twice, I had to sell my soul to the roguelites to have my wish even remotely fulfilled. Roboquest is a run-based FPS with added meta progression. Its gunplay lands somewhere between the best of Overwatch and Borderlands in terms of game feel, and the game excels at offering strong variety within its stacked weapon arsenal, diverse character classes, assorted modifiers, and non-linear map zones, while also ensuring that everything is paced out and dispersed quickly and evenly. I tend to judge these run-based games, or roguelites, by how radically different each run feels from the previous one. I wouldn't say this achieves the Binding of Isaac levels of dramatic transformation on a run-to-run basis, but I think it surpasses the rigidity of a Hades, for example, giving just enough to not feel like the same experience over and over. Roboquest is hesitant to provide you with tools that allow you to disengage from the game, though. You might be able to set up some powerful summons or melee builds, but you're probably not going to automate your kit to turn Roboquest into vampire survivors. No matter what you obtain throughout your run or through your meta unlocks, you will always need to stay moving and stay shooting. Enemies hit hard on their own, but the fangs are really bared when working in packs. If you get too close, enemies are quick to ambush you with everything from snare traps to suicide bombers. However, should you decide to turtle in the back, you'd still need to respect fissure attacks and stealthy assassins. Nowhere is safe. Not to mention, the game judges you based on both a zone's clear time and total percentage of enemies killed. You're allowed to take the game at whatever pace you like, but choosing to ignore enemies will cost you the experience needed to gain new perks and stay combat viable. On the flip side, choosing to drag your ass through each zone will ensure that you are locked out of time-sensitive content and rewards. The game will train you to find a balance between efficiency and proficiency. Roboquest offers a co-op mode as well. You and one buddy of choice can take on the same challenge together, despite any discrepancies that may exist between the two players' individual meta progression unlocks. Drops within the run are instanced as well, meaning both players are free to pick up anything they see guilt-free. Though, any picked up weapon can then be dropped onto the shared field for both players to interact with and trade amongst one another, should they so desire. In single player, your HP hitting 0 results in the end of a run. However, in co-op, a player can revive their fallen comrade by sacrificing 50% of the living player's current HP, meaning infinite revives, but you'll quickly find yourself a touch away from death should you choose to abuse it. If you and your partner are in perfect sync, you can devastate any challenge sent your way, but if there's a considerably weak link amongst the two of you, they will compromise everything. Unless you're lucky enough to find the perk that disables the health penalty for the duration of your run, but where's the fun in that? Low health doesn't have to be a death sentence though, as Roboquest encourages aggressive, in-their-face play by dropping extremely time-sensitive, minor health pickups from slain enemies. This is yet another aspect of the game that is affected by the perk system, as you can work towards increasing the amount of time that these pickups will remain on the field, how many are dropped on average, their efficacy, and your pickup range. Furthermore, certain weapons, usually melee weapons or your built-in melee function, share augments that generate a number of health drops every time a specified condition is met, like executing an enemy with a melee strike. Just be sure you're not sacrificing all of your power in the name of collecting health orbs. A strong defense will not be good enough. What few criticisms I do have feel aimed more towards run-based games in general rather than any unique failings of Roboquest itself. There's also the issue of one's unrealistic, insatiable expectation for more and more content that kind of comes as an unfortunate byproduct of having games like Isaac and Gungeon tower over everyone with their decade plus of integrated content. But that's an entirely different conversation, again, for an entirely different time. The only reasonable item on my wish list is to maybe allow the player to skip the first world entirely. It's a fine introduction, but it's very slow, and even without considering any meta progression, it quickly loses its tension, becoming increasingly stale on successive runs. I would have liked to see high-cost bust upgrades within the meta tree, like higher capacity fuel reserves or more durable tires that would just allow the player to start their runs further in. I wouldn't even mind if the game left you at starting powers, since you'd be able to quickly make up for it with the higher level enemies in a further zone. Assuming you play well, of course. Alternatively, I suppose the option exists to inject the starting zone with harder alternative routes or challenges for players looking to hit the ground running, but I'm trying to refrain from the, quote, just give me more content mentality. During production of this video, I did finally complete a run of the game on hard mode, which took me nearly 20 hours of playtime. I can now confidently speak to the game's difficulty and confirm that it does stay relatively challenging throughout the last few zones. It was definitely no cakewalk. However, I did notice two things during the final boss encounter that I feel are worth sharing before we close out the conversation in full. First, by nature of the final boss being a massive flesh wall, you have to aim pretty high up to reach his weak point, which severely limits your view of everything happening on the ground level, meaning that it's fairly unreasonable to both avoid attacks and apply good DPS simultaneously. And since the boss has so much health, it's equally as unreasonable to only attack during the brief moments of respite that you might find within his attack strings. This funnels directly into my other point, which is that the final boss does feel more of like an item check roguelite boss than a first-person shooter boss. Do you have movement speed? Do you have multiple jumps? How does your survivability look? And of course, do you have a way to deal big, consistent damage? Because without all of those things, you'll likely lose the battle of attrition, especially if you can't even see the bottom half of the screen for the majority of the fight. Aside from retracing my steps through the first zone, the final boss is probably my least favorite part of Roboquest. I've never had an engaging encounter with him, only immediate death or effortless victory, neither of which feels like a result of my performance. I kinda just wish there was more going on than shooting a big ass hitbox for 10 minutes. Preferably something that involves, aiming my gun, or even having the fight change between more distinctive defensive patterns and offensive patterns so that you can actually see what the hell is going on when you need to. I'm not sure if I'll ever have the desire to grind out the game's remaining available content or even continue to play it on a semi-regular basis now that I've hit credits, but it may be the emergency FPS nicotine patch that I pull out when things get especially dire. And let's be clear, I'm not talking shit. 20-ish hours of video game is still a damn good chunk of video game, especially for how little it's asking. And from what I gather, this game has not seen its last content update, so I only expect the quality and value to rise over time. If you want to blast some tunes, roll your eyes back into your skull and let the flow take you away, Roboquest is absolutely my 2023 pick for that. Have you ever run into something so meticulously well crafted that the absence of flaws is itself kind of the biggest flaw? Sea of Stars is a remarkably charming and straightforward traditional JRPG tribute game. The game emulates the nostalgic memory of your favorite SNES era RPGs, while obviously accomplishing a far more impressive visual style and incorporating some much welcome quality of life improvements. In that regard, it kind of feels like the Shovel Knight of JRPGs. Your team of 3 will navigate towns, fields, and dungeons, hopping between the occasional Zelda-esque environmental puzzle and your not-so-random combat encounters. The closest comparison points would be both the Mario RPGs and Chrono Trigger, as Sea of Stars directly borrows both the badges and the active elements of the former alongside the team-up skills of the latter. In the beginning, I found myself quite impressed by the combat system. In addition to what's already been mentioned, it also has that Octopath Traveler thing going on, where enemies all have specific weaknesses that, when hit enough times, cancels their next action. Enemies will always show timers over their heads that reveal how many turns are left before they attack, so your goal should always be canceling as many turns in the most efficient way possible, or bullying the most threatening target so they can never devastate your team with one blow. Enemies hit hard, and you won't be able to mitigate all of the damage. The strategy then becomes deciding who you're going to allow to punch you square in the jaw. As I mentioned, the game is largely built on the foundation that the Mario RPGs laid. Combat, while entirely turn-based, is littered with active elements. By timing presses of the action button with attacks both dealt and received, you can empower your actions, increasing the damage you deal and decreasing the damage you take, respectively. Some spells can be charged, requiring a well-timed hold and release input, while others require you to, for example, air hockey projectiles back and forth at an increasing rhythm. They're fun the first few times that you use them, but the requirements themselves never really change. Once they're committed to muscle memory, they practically just become long, unskippable cutscenes dead in the middle of combat. All that to say, they wear their welcome quick. I'd say there are 2 major complaints preventing me from appreciating this game as much as I'd like. The first being gameplay pacing, specifically in terms of progression and encounter time. This game doesn't have much going on with customization or player expression outside of the badge system. So you're really at the mercy of the game and how often it wants to give you a new skill, character, or mechanic to spice things up with, which just doesn't feel often enough for me. The game feels very rigid and straightforward, like you're just going through the same motions for most of the encounters. Final Fantasy IV made me feel this way as well, but it at least had generally harder battles and a massive open world to explore, alongside a mythos that I had already become invested in. Sea of Stars kinda just feels like a empty battle simulator by comparison. Sea of Stars also fails to grab me with any of its narrative beats. Not to say that anything is outright bad or offensive, it's just kind of forgettable. That's why I haven't even bothered giving you like a breakdown synopsis of it. Sea of Stars is not unique in this, of course, because I think a lot of these throwback RPGs really struggle to find unique or meaningful messages to build their narratives around. They provide a lot of world building, but then they forget to furnish that world with reasons to care about it. In full transparency, I think I tapped out around hour 13, which, according to How Long to Beat, is somewhere in the ballpark of the halfway mark. But even in the unlikely event that things do improve in the back half, I think the damage is already done. Sea of Stars wants to imitate the classics, but that's all it feels like, an imitation. An over-polished, sanded down, perfectly palatable reference piece that constantly reminds me of much better video games that came out at a time when the ecosystem was completely different and my expectations were adjusted appropriately. But if it's any consolation, Square Enix can't even figure out how to capture the essence of the games they used to make. It's really, really hard. And I'm not going to pretend like I could do better on my own. I really do commend the Sea of Stars team for their palpable efforts in making a beautiful piece of visual art though, and one that is so technically sound. It's a perfectly cooked chicken breast, it just unfortunately does not have much in terms of flavor. Like Diablo 4, I just don't see a reason to recommend this game over its contemporaries, unless you just really love Mario RPG and you don't want anything about it to change. I can unfurl you a Santa's list of Earthbound clones with engaging narratives, or a slew of Square-esque RPGs with complex customization and synergistic systems. Hell, I've seen at least 3 Paper Mario clones on Steam in the last year alone. All I'm saying is you have a lot of options for JRPGs that are both true and appropriated, and I think you can get a lot more mileage elsewhere. I would personally recommend that you go play Crystal Project instead. Each year, there's always that one game that feels like it could have been plucked from the deepest part of my subconscious. Something so tailored to my specific taste that it feels violating in a way. Between its bold Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic, Edgar Wright directorial influence, and highly targeted mixture of game genres, Hi-Fi Rush is about as Caleb Bait gets. Combine that with a confident $30 price tag and a same-day shadow drop onto Game Pass platforms and Steam, and you're guaranteed to turn heads. Hi-Fi Rush is a rhythmically infused character action game developed by Tango Gameworks, subsidiary of the Bethesda, ZeniMax, and Xbox game studios Matrushka. They're best known for both the Evil Within series and putting Ikumi Nakamura on stage that one time. After the studio's stint of middling horror games, director John Johannes would be given an opportunity to pitch his long-pondered, tonally antithetical dream game where action and music live in harmony. Imagine your favorite action game, only there's an active metronome ticking to the music as you play. The beat is central to the entire universe. The walls jostle to it, the platforms shift to it, and the enemies, they attack to it. While you, the player, do maintain full control independent of the beat, you are encouraged, incentivized, and graded to stay on rhythm, just like everyone else. On the action front, it has all of the character action staples: juggles, parries, combos, and more. While it is more mechanically simplified compared to its long-running, genre-defining contemporaries, Hi-Fi Rush is by no means a superficial experience. The enemies, in particular, can be very demanding of your attention, queuing attacks one after the other, leaving you with very little room to breathe. There's a healthy variety of archetypes, too, ranging from elemental automatons to shielded sentinels, each requiring selective partner abilities to shred their otherwise indomitable defenses. And when different flavors of enemies are mixed together on the field, it's easy to get overwhelmed in the chaos, especially when a portion of your brain is forever dedicated to staying on beat. Hi-Fi Rush is far from just being a glorified battle simulator, however. In between bashing baddies, you'll be platforming your way through zones straight out of the Dreamcast era. These bright and bustling environments are bursting with color, character, and collectibles aplenty. Each little crack and crevice of playable space is likely to reward your curiosity with delicious in-universe money dollars that can be promptly exchanged for additional attacks, specials, and upgrades alike. Depending on your temperament, this can either be a satisfying treat or an awfully obsessive-compulsive nightmare. And if you've played any stylish action game before, you know these characters jump like marinated bags of bricks. They just don't have the air control conducive to a real-deal platformer. That being said, compared to its action counterparts, Hi-Fi Rush may actually be the most fluid feeling amongst them, thanks to having both a double jump and air dash available from the start. Although it also has the heaviest emphasis on platforming, which causes the score to kind of even out in the end. It's also important to note, while it never asks for any absurd levels of spatial precision, you will have to be comfortable with moving quickly and moving on rhythm, so buyer beware. Hi-Fi Rush is clearly asking a lot of the player, especially anyone who may be inexperienced with the hard action genre or rhythm games. But before you let those warnings scare you off entirely, know that Tango has put tremendous effort into their suite of accessibility and difficulty options to ensure that players can have the most comfortable experience possible. Whether you're concerned about your rhythm, or maybe you just have a little bit of action game performance anxiety, find comfort in knowing that options do exist to mitigate or even potentially vaporize your particular barrier to entry. Whether you're looking to easy mode for softer rhythm requirements, auto action mode to circumvent the need for memorizing and inputting difficult combos, or single key mode so that you only have to press one button during the more traditional rhythm game sections, Tango's got you covered. There's no harm in tailoring the game to fit your specific needs. That's why the options are there. I still use the visualizer option myself, as it helps to keep me grounded and attentive when things get really overwhelming and distracting. On the flip side, I actually think the rhythm components could be beneficial for a subset of inexperienced action game players that may be more musically gifted. Since all of your traditional action game systems can now be traced to an active metronome, learning how to internalize and execute your abilities could, in theory, be much easier here. For example, I find it much easier to execute pause combos in Hi-Fi Rush since I don't have to fully guess the timing. And regarding standard combat, Hi-Fi Rush also doesn't really punish improper play so much as it encourages proper play. Chai's actions buffer to come out on beat regardless of when they're actually input, so you can still largely fumble your way to success. Harder difficulties not necessarily withstanding, of course. Though you'll really want to practice your just timing, as staying on beat does increase your strength and yield higher performance grades. In most cases, you can treat the metronome as a suggestion, but I wouldn't choose to abuse the game's leniency lest you devalue the experience for yourself. All that to say, if the game's got you curious, don't shy away from it. The accommodations are there, and the commitment is super low. Being a rhythm game, this whole thing lives and dies by its soundtrack, or soundtracks in this case. Hi-Fi Rush actually has two different soundtracks, one that includes licensed tracks from artists like Nine Inch Nails and the Black Keys, which are played during major in-game events, or a streamer-friendly original soundtrack from a host of Tango's hired talent. Personally, I don't think there's a cut-and-dry winner amongst the two either. It'll be to your taste on a stage-by-stage basis. It can be a little strange to hear relatively modern real-world music overlaid atop this fantastical futuristic utopia. So if you and I share the same particular type of brainworm, then I would suggest the fantastic original soundtrack for you. But if you're normal, then the licensed route is clearly the intended experience and should probably be played first, if possible. Either way, you're getting stellar tunage either way, so pick your poison. Also, can we talk about how good this thing looks? The beautiful cel-shaded style, the bright and vibrant colors, the tastefully over-the-top chromatic aberration. You even got Peppermint looking like my girl Cat Gravity Rush. Nice. And for as good as this game looks, it also runs like a dream. Even before my recent upgrade, I ran into zero performance issues on my GTX 1080. No stuttering, no frame drops, no lengthy load times, no crashes. It just works, which is really saying something nowadays. Best of all, after months and months of games that feel like they never end, Hi-Fi Rush clocks in just under 10 hours for first run story completion. Think about all the things you can do with that saved time, like playing more Hi-Fi Rush, which you should absolutely do because it's got some really neat additional modes as well. You can utilize the game's chapter select to sample the other soundtrack, tackle harder difficulties, grind out those S ranks, or search for the newly accessible challenge rooms scattered throughout the campaign, all while keeping your previous unlocks and partners. If you like to keep things simple and to the point, the Rhythm Tower is the place for you. Here you will race against the clock, climbing higher and higher while fighting deadlier and deadlier foes. Will you find yourself atop the stairway to heaven, or will you take the highway back down to hell? If you'd rather slam the turbo button, BPM Rush is a short, 20-ish minute baddie brawl where the tempo grows faster and faster. Double time your dopamine and see if you can stay afloat as the chaos washes over you. If you're looking for more of an honest challenge, each run of Power Up Tower Up resets Chai back to 0 for the sake of sweet, sweet roguelite progression. Upon clearing each floor, Chai can choose to accept various power-ups or even relinquish his rewards for a higher score multiplier. You dirty leaderboard freaks are gonna get a kick out of this one. And finally, for the sweet candied cherry on top, you can use the unified currency acquired from any of the game's modes to buy some fire cosmetics in the post-game cosmetic shop. For a $30 video game, Tango Gameworks is happy to assault the player with excessive value, which definitely makes me feel better about buying Ghostwire Tokyo at full price. Thanks, Tango! With the game's praises aptly sung, I think it's now the best time to detail which aspects may have fallen a bit flat. As I've mentioned, platforming is unavoidable. While not particularly demanding, some chapters are more heavily designed around its inclusion. Most infamously, Chapter 7 with its obsessive, slow vertical climb up a level-spanning spire. A to B traversal as a whole can grow dreadfully dull as the game's tempo and, by extension, Chai's movement speed is set at a fixed 4-4 time signature for the entire game. It's surprising that there aren't instances where the tempo might change to match the energy of a stage, as I think the more heisty levels would have greatly benefit from this specifically. But even within the confines of a 4-4 signature, a DMC-style auto-sprint could still work in double time. Alternatively, the pre-existing grounded dash could be augmented to be more in line with, I'm gonna say it, everybody sound the alarms, the sound surfing in Neo The World Ends With You. That game feels like riding a roller coaster, whereas Hi-Fi Rush is about as high octane as walking through the ride queue. There are also obstructions to the flow of combat as well. Firstly, Hi-Fi Rush is extremely guilty of throwing in parry sequences whenever it doesn't really know what else to do. Most notably, this happens with each of the elite class mobs you encounter in the game. Upon hitting a certain health threshold, elites will enter a Kingdom Hearts-esque desperation phase, where they'll knock you back into a neutral position before forcing a demented game of rhythmic telephone on you. Though I understand the need to put the player in a situation where they can safely give their full attention to this mechanic, I don't like being forced out of action to execute a finishing blow. This feels more at home as a punishment mechanic for being hit by certain attacks, rather than a reward for hitting an enemy's health threshold. I think a simple at-will contextual action like the glory kills in the Doom reboots would have been a far more appropriate approach for this personally. Credit due, you can circumvent this mechanic altogether by parrying the initial shockwave that's sent out by the enemy. It's kind of awkward though, because they'll attempt to follow up a couple more times and you'll have to just keep parrying that shockwave before they just unceremoniously give up and return to normal. As a result, it feels way more like a failsafe than a intended feature, I guess, but I'm not going to go and make any full-on accusations. I just don't think it flows with the rest of combat at all, and the worst part of it is that it just happens so frequently that it really does become a nuisance. Furthermore, these for lack of a better term, call and response components, are all prefabricated to fit a 4/4 time signature, rather than to mesh sonically with a given track. So not only does it become predictable and solvable after like the first or second time you see it, but it also takes away from the musical experience. Personally, it's just a mechanic that I would just gut out of the game altogether. Even with standard mobs, the combat can occasionally become a bit of a cacophonous mess. I think knowing when an attack is going to go off is largely clear, but knowing how many successive hits there's going to be, it feels very hit or miss. Some tells I think are well telegraphed, but others feel completely obfuscated. And the more enemies that are on screen, the more unpredictable things can really start to feel. Not to cross-pollute the reviews here, but I kind of mentioned this in my discussion about Spider-Man 2 for the PlayStation 5, but this game similarly suffers from forcing you out of a combo in order to react to incoming attacks. Like Spider-Man, enemies are fairly beefy and combos can be kind of lengthy since, the time signature that you're married to. It's nice that you're able to cancel out of pretty much anything at will into any of your defensive options, but it does feel really frustrating when you just want to hit something with your finishing blow and the game refuses to let you. Aerial attacks and partner abilities can help to ease this issue, but I feel like it kind of forms a bit of an over-reliance on them as a result, which is kind of a different problem on its own. I'm still pretty conflicted on how I feel about the game's final moveset, because I know it's a first attempt and there's already a lot going on, so I wouldn't say having an extensive list of moves on top of that is the right call, but only having one weapon to use does get really repetitive, and I feel like I'm only ever sticking with the same 3 or 4 combos just because they're the most reliable. Partner abilities are also carrying a lot of weight. As I mentioned, they're necessary for putting certain enemies into a vulnerable state for Chai, but their general use, specifically for, I would say, Peppermint and Corsica, is just to spam projectiles on cooldown. That alone is enough to permanently stagger most bosses, and it doesn't require any sort of timing or resource to execute. Moving forward, my hope would be that they would flesh out the partner characters and maybe make them feel more like stance changes, for example, rather than the glorified Marvel assists that they are right now. The game also uses a chip system, which is not entirely dissimilar to like Nier Automata's chip system or even Kingdom Hearts' ability points. Chips are just these little upgradable modifiers that Chai can equip to marginally increase positive attributes or decrease negative ones. They're pretty uninspiring, and I never really felt the need to engage with the system. I honestly think it could just be gutted altogether in favor of literally anything else. Also, hi, video game industry, I'm talking directly to you here. Kingdom Hearts solved the lock-on problem like 2 decades ago. Why are we still putting games out where I can't hit the target that I want to? Hi-Fi Rush, for whatever reason, lacks any hard lock-on feature. It also has no visual guide for which target is currently soft-locked, so all you can really do is point the camera in a crowd of enemies and pray to God that things go your way. And to its credit, most of the time, I guess it does, but until it doesn't and you die for it. Dying to something that isn't your fault is already frustrating on its own. I don't have to tell you that, but it's infinitely worse when you're then forced to sit through an encounter's preceding expository dialogue dump for a second or third time. Hi-Fi Rush does let you skip its traditional cutscenes, but tutorials, cutaways, and prestige walkie-talkie sections do not qualify. Even during chapter select, you still have to sit and just wait through all of the preamble that you've already heard. As much as I love the 6th console generation, this was one of the things you did not need to carry over. Several internet dwellers have fairly criticized the game's writing for trudging closely to Marvel's quippy, often cringy character dialogue. As someone who is equally exhausted of this style, I'll say that I found Hi-Fi Rush largely inoffensive. It's a cartoon in the most traditional sense. It's unserious and sugary sweet, and it's entirely self-aware that it is this inherently goofy thing. Unlike a Marvel film or a Forspoken, for example, Hi-Fi Rush doesn't attempt to smother itself with incessant melodrama, or use quips solely as a crutch for the audience's attention. It feels very sincere, and that's always been the make or break ingredient for me in any piece of work. Hi-Fi Rush is having a blast living as an interactable mid-aughts cartoon, proudly wearing its Japanese anime and boomer rock inspirations like face tattoos. Tango clearly made something for themselves, but are happy to share it with everyone else. That's what makes it so infectious, even with all the speed bumps you might encounter along the way. I give the highest form of kudos to Tango Gameworks for not only shattering their tired mold with something fresh and polarizing, but taking a gamble and doing so in a way that is more easily accessible for players across the board. And credit where credit's due, gotta give a congratulations to Xbox. I mean, they technically finally released a single video game that people care about. You eagle-eyed viewers out there may have noticed that I have considerably less to say about Diablo 4 in comparison to the other games present on this list. Between a personal Activision boycott and certain free-to-play contemporaries, I had originally had no plans to even play Diablo 4. I figured at best, I'd probably waste a weekend on it after it inevitably came out on Game Pass. But the graciousness of a desperate friend, and their aversion to playing good games with me, resulted in a gifted copy hitting my inbox shortly after launch. Dude, look, it was either this or League of Legends, okay? Like off script? Please understand. As someone who got extremely casually interested in Diablo 3 back at launch, Diablo 4 is exactly what I expected. It's just as mindlessly addicting, but it's wrapped in a much less interesting package. Diablo 3 was overflowing with a confident use of color, to the point where white men on the internet were really upset about it. It had a visual identity that was easily recognizable at a glance, especially in a time that was largely dominated by yellows, browns, and sometimes grays. Diablo 4, however, opts for a more photorealistic, muted, and mundane by design aesthetic, which, personal preference beware, doesn't really do a whole lot for me. The game's got something of a weak visual identity overall, IMO. I'd probably struggle to pick it from a crowd of other isometric games if I didn't already know what those looked like. I definitely can't recall even the vaguest of enemy silhouettes or town layouts, and I've beat the game twice! The speed at which your eyes begin to instantly filter out and auto-glaze over 99% of the game's visual information really highlights just how much of a dopamine sweatshop these games really are. Which is fine, but like, we don't even try to maintain the illusion anymore. Speaking of illusions, D4's foundation is an always online, quote, open world realm. It's trying to weasel its way into that wannabe MMO territory like Destiny did, and it's more trouble than it's worth here. On average, you're likely to see maybe 1 or 2 people passing by in the overworld. It's not exactly the dream pitch of you and your fire team strolling up on world events to join strangers in jolly cooperation. It's really just people sitting AFK in towns like they're playing MapleStory or something. Worst part is, this lousy feature comes at the cost of frequent hitching and slow server response times. D3 may have been always online too, but aside from the initial launch bottleneck, I almost never ran into any issues that impacted me in-game. Meanwhile, I feel like every time I hit a transition point in the overworld in D4, my game slideshows for like 2 seconds before rubber banding me forward in time. And God forbid I ever fat finger the cash shop button. Might as well just delete System 32 at that point. Furthermore, due to the nature of the open world, the game is disproportionately meandering from one side of a massive map to another. Sure, you do eventually learn mounts and fast travel points to cut down on the issue, but then you've practically rendered all of that space meaningless. And I know the post-game is largely dependent on visiting different resource deposits scattered around said overworld, but I find that far less engaging than just like replaying a linear mission structure on progressively harder difficulties, or dare I say, running maps in PoE. Oops, I said it. The thing is, the game itself really isn't all bad. When it's flowing free of technical issues, it flows well enough. I have a decent time in the more traditional style dungeons. The class and ability variety are about what I'd expect. The animations are crunchy and impactful. Respeccing your character is fairly painless, and the more restrictive health potions do actually make things more tense. However, I specifically want to highlight the way this game approaches both its difficulty and its subsequent playthroughs, because instead of creating a fresh character and being forced to run through the entirety of a campaign again, you can just plop a brand new level 1 character straight into the post-game overworld on whatever difficulty suits you best, while retaining the option to switch between those difficulties at will. And though the content itself varies, I appreciate the freedom to choose one's preferred leveling method, whether it be grinding mobs like a Korean MMO, new game plussing the campaign, or focusing entirely on seasonal content in the overworld. You dictate your own leveling path, and I think that's the game's best feature by far. As a social game or something for my hands to do during a podcast or a YouTube binge, it's completely serviceable. I'm definitely not familiar enough with the intricacies of a traditional ARPG or how their in-games necessarily function to confidently identify what major problems may or may not lie under the hood for hardcore players. To me, it's just another one of these games, which is exactly why I can't confidently bolster it up on its own. Like, why would I ever suggest Diablo 4 to anyone when they could just play Diablo 2, Diablo 3, any of the Torchlight games, or specifically Path of Exile for little to no cost at all? Unless you're just really intimidated by something like Path of Exile, in which case I guess I understand. That said, things are obviously subject to change due to the live environment of D4, and the game will only become more financially accessible with time, so who knows, we could all be singing a very different tune about D4's quality come the game's first expansion, but I don't think I'd really be willing to put any money on that. I've been noticing this strange phenomenon over the last few years, where certain games will release to a torrent of critical praise and positive word of mouth, only to completely disappear from the conversation within a 24-hour period. I couldn't tell you if this is the result of ethically bankrupt multimedia websites, publisher puppeteered talking heads, or the fact that there are just a dozen games coming out every day fighting for our dwindling time and attention. But growing up in and around video game conversation spaces, I find it really weird when games just disappear entirely from the collective conscious. I decided to name this self-proclaimed marvel after the game that I felt best exemplified it at the time. Thus, the Deathloop effect was born, and it has been something of a small obsession of mine ever since. Games would come and go in the time between, of course, with interest in things like Atomic Heart flatlining, whilst games like God of War Ragnarok failed to set the world on fire. But nothing really came close to the full-on Christian Rapture status of Deathloop by Arcane Studios. That is, until one fateful day in February of the year 2023. But first, we need to go back even farther. Back in 2018, Square released a game titled Octopath Traveler. In addition to having a staggering new visual style, it was also one of the few notable exclusives that the Switch was slated to receive that year. People weren't just hungry for Octopath Traveler, they were in a panicked starvation mode. However, when it finally did release on July 13th, reception ended up being all over the place. On one hand, it was a fully competent, more traditional JRPG from Square Enix at a time when their gamography had been largely dominated by the action genre. It had a unique yet heavily nostalgic visual style, a soundtrack befitting of its lineage, and gameplay that would be unhindered by the hardware's admittedly lackluster specifications. It was a perfect pre-release storm. However, more plot-attentive players began expressing concern about the game's 8 individual character stories, skeptical if they would ever meld together into a cohesive and deliberate plot. This skepticism was reinforced by the game's persistent failure to include bystanding party members in the events of the active participant. No unique one-off dialogues would be provided, not even generic static responses. This quote-unquote party was nothing more than a collection of battle mannequins. For a game about the concept of unity, it was strangely disconnected, and once that opinion hit social media, it was completely ruinous. Few were willing to further their investment into a story that they already knew did not provide proper payoff, and even fewer were willing to take what was there at face value. Not that I blame them, I gave up too, though I think a part of me expected Square to do the same. The sequel would eventually come to release in February of 2023. It clearly maintained the same style and structure as the original, but the question remained: would they acknowledge their past mistakes, let alone do anything to fix them? Initial reviews lauded Octopath Traveler II for its improved character writing, mindful quality of life additions, and solution to the narrative disconnect that once Achilles healed its predecessor. Many well-meaning contributors went as far to claim that Octopath Traveler II had rendered the original, quote, obsolete. This total change of heart got me really curious as I scrolled through dozens of similar sentiments within the Steam user reviews. Not quite curious enough to elicit a FOMO impulse purchase, thankfully, but curious enough to get me to very impatiently await the first 50% discount. In the time that followed, I couldn't help but notice that the conversation had stopped before it ever really began. Outside of the Steam store page, I hadn't heard anyone mention the game unless they were a podcast host acknowledging that it had been released. It felt really weird for a big Square Enix RPG, especially one that reviewed so highly critically, to have less than no social presence. And of course, that only made me more curious. Finally, Deathloop had met its match. I return to you now in mid-January at the time of writing this with 40 hours of Octopath Traveler II freshly imprinted upon my mind. And though I may not have extensive knowledge of the original game, I'm confident that my basic understanding will suffice in my asking and answering of whether or not Octopath Traveler 2 truly does invalidate the original. I guess to get it out of the way, the answer is, yeah, it actually kind of does. But I feel like it's the video game equivalent of guessing 1 cent higher than your opponent on The Price is Right. Like, yeah, it's technically closer to being correct, but also go fuck yourself, you didn't really do anything. It's not this wildly transformative Kingdom Hearts to Kingdom Hearts 2 style jump in execution, but in deciding to take it at face value and attempt to appreciate it for what it is, I do think Octopath Traveler 2 is pretty great. For what it is. Until it isn't. Octopath 2's best moments occur when left to explore the world at a leisurely pace, whether it be scouring the overworld for chests and optional dungeons, or simply chatting up NPCs in and around town. It's easy to become absorbed in Octopath's universe when it is allowed room to breathe. One of the key back-of-the-box selling points for the sequel is the ability to toggle between day and night at the press of a button. Performing this simple action will not only do the obvious, but also transition the soundtrack from a series of energetic, full-range anthems to more gentle, minimalistic lullabies, respectively. The types of enemies encountered will change as well, with much deadlier and much more rewarding threats coming out at night, but perhaps my favorite interaction with the system comes by way of the game's NPCs. Both townsfolk and passerby will shuffle and relocate between the different times of day. For example, a disgruntled townsguard posted by the gate by day may become a chatty drunkard sitting outside of the inn by night. This can often result in access to new areas, quests, or information, depending, but it always results in a different approach to interaction. You see, each of the game's protagonists, hereinafter travelers, come equipped with 2, what I'll call social skills. I think the technical term is path actions or something, but I like mine better, it's just a little bit easier to remember. Anyway, these social skills are semi-unique to each traveler and offer different ways the player can interact with NPCs. It could consist of a singular low-tier healing item all the way up to several end-game weapons, often without rhyme or reason. Depending on the travelers you currently have active in your party of 4, you'll be able to choose between purchasing, begging, mugging, and outright stealing these items from their holder. But we know that the one thing more valuable than gold is information. You won't always know who has the particular insight you're searching for, but you do have access to a few social skills that can help you brute force your way to wisdom, such as bribing, scrutinizing, coercing, and inquiring. For problems that can only be solved by an extra set of hands, consider hiring, tempting, befriending, or guiding powerful NPCs to join your quest. Not only will this allow you to call upon their aid in battle, but they'll also follow your party around in the overworld like Pokemon, which is super cute. Though sometimes you just gotta beat some dude's fucking ass. Provoking and ambushing are two ways to go about this, but why would you ever do that when matching them with your warrior could result in the learning of an enemy's weapon skill, Sharingan style? For the vegans of video games, however, pacifist options are available upon request, and by that I mean the singular soothing command. Existing technically as a part of the previous set of abilities, I believe that this is used to relocate ill people that may be otherwise obstructing an area. I don't know, they kinda phoned that one in. Since each traveler is equipped with 2 of these skills, assuming you're running a full party of 4, I'm fairly certain that you're guaranteed to have access to each archetype of social skill at any given time. I don't know, I don't test shit, but that's what I mean when I say they are semi-unique. The use method and flavor text associated may differ from character to character, but the end results have a lot of overlap. Of course, these abilities do have their limitations. Success with these abilities varies on things like a character's current level, their reputation, which in this context is basically just the number of attempts you're given. There's also winning a one-on-one combat encounter, or simply how many of a given resource you have at the time. But these conditions are always spelled out ahead of time, so you always have a good idea of what you're getting into. However, there is one more important detail that sort of ties everything we've discussed together. While each traveler does indeed have 2 social skills each, it is the time of day that actually indicates which of the 2 is currently active. To put it plainly, each character has a day ability and a night ability. And since NPCs tend to shuffle around during that change, you might find yourself unable to use the desired skill on the desired NPC, or even access that particular NPC at all within that time frame. To offer an example, I would typically use my dancer to beg at every NPC, since this would allow me to clean out their inventories without expending any resources whatsoever. The only limitation, however, is that I would be denied items that were above my dancer's current level, so then I would have to switch over to, let's say, my merchant, and assuming that the NPC's inventory had not changed between the cycle of day and night, purchase those leftover items with money, since there's no level restriction for that particular social skill. This worked great when I had money, didn't need to change the time of day, or was able to easily locate the NPC after a time change. But there would often be times where an NPC would be entirely inaccessible during a cycle, and I had to rely on one or the other usable skills. It's the game's way of encouraging and rewarding use of the full spectrum of social skills without feeling overly restrictive and obnoxious, and I do actually quite like it. Though I'll admit, knowing that any one-off NPC could be holding the metaphorical keys to the kingdom made me slam the action button on hundreds of NPCs with an obsessive compulsion. It's like the video game FOMO equivalent of giving yourself Tourette's from TikToks. I never really clicked with Bravely Default's store and release or Shin Megami Tensei's abuse the weakness approaches to turn-based combat, but Octopath Traveler as a series has been able to strike an interesting balance between the two for me. Combat feels more mindfully resource managey without feeling one-note, which tickles my brain in all of the right ways. A typical encounter follows a similar flow. You want to start by identifying as many of the enemy's weaknesses as efficiently as possible. You can do this by using multi-target, multi-hit, and/or multi-aspected abilities, using a scan ability, or simply bashing them with basic attacks until something sticks. Once identified, you want to use your weakest, cheapest attacks that are aspected to that particular weakness to break an enemy's defenses, whilst storing up your resources. Once broken, the enemy's turn will be delayed, leaving them susceptible to devastating damage. This is your opportunity to cash out your accumulated resources for a full frontal assault, or to safely mend your struggling party. Alternatively, you can just choose to break even, dealing moderate damage whilst maintaining a comfortable amount of resources, just in case. It's all about finding a rhythm that works for you and knowing exactly when to hold them versus when to fold them. Personally, I find that RPGs tend to live or die based on their freedom of self-expression. I want to build a team to my tastes and push myself to make it work. Making the best of a situation is far more engaging to me than being the best in a situation. And sure, Octopath Traveler II may not be a Darkest Dungeon or even a Final Fantasy XII, but between its 8 characters, dual classing, secret jobs, risk-reward equipment, and all of the nonsense that's doable through social skills, it's easy to make that journey feel like your journey. Which makes it hurt so much worse when the game's poor structure takes it all away from you. Octopath Traveler 2 makes me so furious because of how close it is to being noteworthy, and how a handful of just absolutely boneheaded decisions undo the good that is there. This shit is fundamentally flawed at the series level. The revelatory utterance of the word Octopath must have made up the entire elevator pitch, and as a result, these games are forever bound to the concept of 8 individual protagonists with their own self-contained narratives, ensuring that this series will continue to awkwardly flounder in repetitious mediocrity for as long as it exists. In a sick sort of way, Octopath 2 really is the perfect sequel. It evokes, with such extreme precision, the same negative emotions that I had only experienced second-handedly from the first game, and, by extension, Bravely Default. Now I can finally claim my place in this exclusive club of tortured souls, my fear of missing out on missing out completely absolved. Despite what those initial Steam reviews would have me believe, the narrative structure has not been significantly improved. It's still 8 mediocre, disconnected stories that fail to overlap until it's far too late. Attempts were made to satisfy these past complaints, but not necessarily to solve them. Octopath Traveler 2 opts into these optional Tales of-esque field dialogues where characters can shoot the shit apropos of nothing. It's all relationship-building flavor text, which is meaningless when your characters don't fucking talk to each other outside of them. They also occur so infrequently that they feel like an afterthought's afterthought. Just the absolute bare minimum when it comes to bandage solutions to a legitimately crippling issue. The same can be said for the game's other attempts to have the protagonists interact with one another, a series of micro-quests called Crossed Paths. These are basically filler episodes or dates between 2 predestined party members. While these definitely do force the travelers to momentarily perceive one another, it still feels disjointed to go from 0 interaction to direct uninterrupted interaction, then right back to 0 interaction again. It's just teasing at that point, especially when these stories don't feel like they're building towards anything. The only time the narrative ever converges onto a singular focus is after you've completed all 8 of the travelers' full individual plot lines, at which point it kind of feels like the ending of Final Fantasy IX, wherein a world-ending threat just sort of materializes into existence. To give credit where it's due, I've skimmed through some of the readily available story breakdowns, and I've seen the planted seeds and the visible strings that stitch together the context for how these events came to be, but after 40 hours of sickeningly simple shonen plots in which my characters do not acknowledge one another, I'm not really noticing, let alone internalizing small plot details anymore, sorry to say. But actually, you know what? forget the plot for a minute. My gills are way more gaffed by the ramifications that this type of structure has on the gameplay experience. You begin the game by selecting your desired starting character and playing out their first chapter. Afterwards, you're granted the freedom to splinter off and recruit any number of your 7 remaining travelers at your own pace. Each character exists on a different region within the game's map, meaning you'll have to practically circle the globe in order to acquire everyone. This becomes an issue when considering that every character's first chapter and starting area need to act as sufficient tutorial for the entire game, since the player is able to start with any of them. Are you seeing where I'm getting at with this? Quickly did I begin to feel disincentivized from picking up additional characters, because they all start at level 1. So not only do you have to go out of your way to invest in them, but it also feels like you're pressing the restart button 7 different times within the first 10 hours of playtime. You're constantly running forward and you're going nowhere. Excluding your starting character, their first chapters are actually completely optional, so the game's effectively telling you, hey man, this doesn't actually really matter. Then you can only have 4 travelers in your active party at any given time, and your off-party members will not scale alongside them. So if you're anything like me, you find the party that best suits your needs, and you leave the others benched for 30 hours. Because, as we covered, their abilities all overlap, so no single character is ever necessary for progress. Well, come to find out, you actually need to complete the plot lines of all 8 characters in order to access the game's finale, and only ending, meaning that despite being a full RPG's length of time into this video game and having decked out my main party in end-game gear, I have to press the metaphorical reset button again and drag my 4 remaining level 1 party members through hours of content in order to receive any conclusion to my 40-hour investment. This game has done everything mechanically possible to devalue your party members and label anything after 5 as pure excess. Yet despite this, the plot still quietly demands full story completion in order to not just receive the best ending, but any ending. And sure, you can make the argument that, Caleb, you can just use your over-leveled party members to drag the lower levels through their stories one by one. And yeah, you'd probably be right, but that's still several hours of completely brain-dead gameplay at that point. And then, let's say I do go down that route, I don't know what the final act actually looks like. What if it's entirely undoable without having all 8 of the travelers completely combat ready? No matter how much I may have enjoyed hours 15 through 35, which was quite a lot, admittedly, having all of that work just come to a complete stop, having the game go, okay, now everything you just did, do it again, broke something in my brain that has remained broken since, if you can't tell. It hollowed me out like a broken engagement, and I've never found the will to reach that final act myself. Defeated, I've had no option other than to just watch it on YouTube rather than suffer any longer. I feel like I fooled myself into trying to create my own story with Octopath Traveler II. I tried to inject my own character interactions, my own relationships, my own motivations where there were none, because I took the game's abstinence as permission to do so. I treated my often silent protagonists like silent protagonists, and then right at the end, the game decided to give them all a conflicting voice from my own. What I thought was the game giving me freedom to choose was the game failing to communicate its own expectations with the player. Octopath Traveler 2 is very much attempting to tell a static story, but it is largely structured in a way that obfuscates its own intent. It's fine if it wants to be something that clashes with my specific tastes, but it needs to be upfront with the expectations of the player. It needs to have something like smaller centralized goals for the player to regularly hit in order to ensure that they stay on the larger task. If the freedom is an illusion, then I would rather it be taken away. I'm going to throw out an idea here, but what if the game was served in portions, region by region? Let Region A consist of a handful of characters and give them real interactions. Learn their systems, their synergies, their personalities. Have them share a brief final dungeon and a boss fight. Then change to Region B with a whole new group of characters and rinse and repeat. And once you've finished all of the individual regions, then you can open up the world with all 8 travelers in tow and start building towards that shared goal. Alternatively, just incorporate some kind of 8-person battle system and have everything scale. Or, after you've completed one traveler's final chapter, just literally put an option in the end to summarize any remaining traveler's story and just shit them out at some static level like 50 or something. There's 1,000 different ways to go about this, and I'm just spitballing random ideas off the top of my head, so you can't tell me that a team of seasoned professionals can't come up with something better. My big question really boils down to, what is the point of offering all of this freedom in the beginning if all of the paths lead to the same destination? I just don't understand. I would have loved to carry on conversations with fellow Octoheads and see where all of the hubbub was really coming from, and see if I've somehow missed key elements that make this all make sense. But I've not found a single real living person that has played it. So, in closing, I salute thee, Octopath Traveler II. You've won this long and hard-fought battle of supreme mediocrity and conversational absence. Deathloop's run officially ends here, yet you will live on, immortalized as yet another Square Enix game that has broken my heart and wasted my time. I don't know what it is about indies and their highly specific ability to routinely make bomb-ass survival horror games every year, but they literally can't keep getting away with it. My Friendly Neighborhood caught my attention pretty early in development, as one-off gifs of human-sized puppets being shot dead by a Rolodex began to hit my Twitter feed. As I dove deeper into the dev's Twitter account, I remember being really impressed by their dedication to respecting the whimsy and innocence of children's programming. In a post-Five Nights at Freddy's world especially, it feels like you can't take a single step forward without tripping over a minefield of low-hanging, barely satirical, quote, mascot horrors that are no deeper than, dude, what if VeggieTales but like Satan instead? Maybe it's because I'm quickly morphing into an old man, but it was really nice to see a tasteful approach to an otherwise edgy, lazy, and oversaturated subgenre. Years after its cancellation, the titular children's television series My Friendly Neighborhood has suspiciously began broadcasting once again. You play as Gordon, a repairman tasked with the investigation and disabling of the broadcast tower located at the thought-to-be-abandoned MFN studio. Though the show's known to be sentient cast of puppets have taken control, and they're not letting anyone disrupt their signal without a fight. As I've mentioned, My Friendly Neighborhood, the game, shows a great level of restraint with its theme, allowing the raw uncanniness of human-sized Henson-esque puppets to generate the necessary tension on their own. These puppets don't need bloodied, hollowed-out eyes or rows of human teeth to elicit a fear response. Sometimes the persistent threat of a non-consenting hug is all you need. After all, you're watching a video game critique on the internet. We both know you're afraid of intimacy. Presenting the game this way also has the added benefit of lulling the player into something akin to a false sense of security, meaning that whenever the game does decide to jump out and yell boo at you, it's way more effective and embarrassing than it probably should have been. With that said, the scare factor is still largely tame. Unless you have some very specific type of trauma, I highly doubt you will find the imagery to be an issue. And the game isn't so much jump scary as it is jump silly, which is a really fun series of emotions to experience in tandem. Though the general uncertainty and very real hostility of said puppets should do well to keep you on your toes regardless. Where gameplay is concerned, it's pretty bog standard. Gordon has the type of basic movement you'd expect, with no jumps, no vaulting, no sprinting, but he does retain full 360-degree movement. Gen Zers rejoice. Aside from his exceptional melee weapon, the wrench, he's also equipped with mechanical print-based firearms, such as the Stenographer and Novelist, proving that the pin is mightier as a gun. Littered across the game world are consumables capable of putting a pep in Gordon's step, like health tonics and temporary speed-increasing chocolate bars. As one might expect, all of these precious resources are limited, though not necessarily scarce, at least as the game's default difficulty is concerned. Despite its first-person perspective and invoking of the RE4 attaché case for inventory management, MFN actually has a lot more in common with the Resident Evil PSX trilogy, as they both prioritize navigation and problem-solving over the action itself. My Friendly Neighborhood, like Resident Evil, achieves this by several reasons, but particularly by making enemies respawn after an unspecified amount of time. This obviously encourages more thoughtful and conservative backtracking, provides more opportunities for the player to expend their resources, and helps to keep the tension while revisiting previous locations. Of course, should you find a room with particularly high foot traffic, you can opt to spend a precious roll of duct tape to permanently bind the troublesome foes, rendering them completely harmless for the remainder of the game. Theming aside, perhaps the most original idea that MFN presents is turning the Resident Evil ink ribbons into something of a general currency. While tokens are primarily used for saving your progress, they can also be spent at vending machines to acquire more chocolate bars, or at health refueling stations to do as the name suggests. It's a novel idea, even if the game's high item count doesn't fully warrant the need. Again, at least on the game's normal difficulty. Difficulty is always a, difficult conversation. MFN offers a total of 5 different difficulties, ranging from friendly, which is a tier below normal, to unfriendly, being 3 tiers above normal, and the latter is locked until certain conditions have been met. I've only played on normal, which is usually the case, and found the game to be pretty breezy all around. Ammo was plentiful, health items were overwhelming, and the wrench was more than capable of solving nearly every combat encounter on its own. The only real speed bumps were my own poor navigational skills and the occasional brain fart during puzzle time, but still no significant roadblocks there either. I don't want to dog on the game for being too easy, since it A, does present several different difficulty options, and B, does suggest the survival difficulty to genre-experienced players. However, as I'm sure you've encountered in your own time playing video games, these descriptors are often unreliable or entirely misguiding. Resident Evil 4 Remake. There is a much larger conversation to have about game difficulties and how poorly they've been communicated over the years, but we'll have to save that for another day. All that really needs to be said right now is that normal is pretty undertuned. If I were to make one change for normal myself, I would cut the amount of available health tonics in half, at least. This could even be balanced out by dropping more coins in their place. The idea is to encourage more use of the health stations since they're otherwise pretty superfluous. It also have the side effect of freeing up more inventory space, which I'm sure would be a welcome gift for the inexperienced players playing on normal. Something that does cascade throughout all difficulties, though, is the oppressive power of the wrench. Its damage output is really solid, don't get me wrong, but the real danger comes from its range, speed, and stopping power combined. It's quite easy to barricade yourself behind pieces of the environment just outside of the enemy's reach, where you can still bash the hell out of them. Even in standard use, a couple quick hits will typically stun an enemy long enough for you to walk around them completely unbothered. It's almost too fun to suggest making any adjustments to it, kind of in the same vein of the Halo 1 Magnum, but it definitely trivializes a lot of encounters. Not to imply that the game is concealing high-end storytelling or thrilling mysteries, but I still like to refrain from explicit spoiler territory when at all possible. However, I do have some thoughts about the game's finale that is likely to take up a chunky half of this segment's runtime, so if you'd like to remain in the dark or you just really hate when I meander about something trivial, I'd suggest going ahead and jumping into the next chapter of the video. After Gordon makes the choice to pull the plug on the broadcast, lightning strikes the tower, causing him to tumble down into the depths of the studio. He stumbles back to his feet only to find himself in a dark, eerie soundstage with a defaced town sign that now reads, "The Unfriendly Neighborhood." A nearby barricade explodes with a roaring boom from which a twisted train of monsterified puppets scurries, chasing Gordon. What makes them look so monstrous, you might ask? Well, nothing more than rows of human teeth and hollowed-out eyes, of course. The player then takes 5 steps forward, up and over a convenient platform, and right into the game's final boss encounter against a Frankenstein's Katamari of Feltish freaks, aptly named the Amalga Puppet. I'm left kind of stunned by this game's final segment because not only does it give in to the mascot horror fantasy that I had been praising them for avoiding all of this time, but it also feels so rushed and abrupt, lasting maybe a total of 5 minutes from start to finish, that it feels like a lose-lose situation regardless of whether you wanted this type of escalation or not. The idea here is that the puppets grew curious about the shows that the humans chose to watch over their own, and as they began investigating, the negativity and darkness that they witnessed from the outside human world began twisting them into nightmare versions of themselves. Though that's kind of all the context you get. You don't really get to see the physical transformation occur and whether it's via magical influence or the puppets simply ripping themselves apart in response. You don't know if it was a gradual mental breakdown over the course of years or whether it was an instantaneous fruit of knowledge situation. You also don't know whether it's irreversible, nor do you make any real attempt to find out or help these poor victims, which is doubly strange for players that had been choosing to help puppets throughout the rest of the story when possible. I can't help but feel like the game should have committed itself to dedicated routes that led to the game's already available multiple endings. Since the game needs you to see the unfriendly neighborhood, it forces Gordon to make a potentially out-of-character choice to disable the broadcast, only to then, at the game's conclusion, allow the player to make a decision that's potentially out of character for their version of Gordon, which is to assist the puppets in running the studio. It's not like he has any sort of tangible epiphany during his brief stint in the Unfriendly Neighborhood set. If anything, I'd expect it to have the opposite effect. So I'm a little lost as to why he's so suddenly eager to help. I'm of the belief that the players should have been locked into certain outcomes based on their decisions throughout the story. Although, if an explicit choice must have been given to the player, it probably should have been deciding whether to kill the broadcast or not. But hey, I'll play ball. If the creator really wanted to go down the route of mascot horror from the beginning, I'll stand by it. But I don't think what we got satisfies that craving either. Like I said, it's too non-committal. We needed more time to wander the set and to observe those creatures from a distance. What kind of shows were they watching? What does the transformation process actually look like? After listening to the same 6 lines of jolly dialogue for 5 hours, I would have loved to hear the neighbors finally express fear, rage, distress, anything. Watching their movements change, their attitudes change, all of that would have been far more unnerving than putting my grandma's dentures in their mouth and having them chase me for 20 feet. Regardless of where you want the game to go narratively, the finale needed a little bit more room to breathe. And since the game's core message is about being a friendly neighbor, I think it's outrageous that there's no in-game attempt to aid the unfriendly neighborhood, not even as an option. Despite my TED Talk, I still had a wonderful time in the neighborhood. The game is derivative, it's definitely a little janky, and it's not super scary, but it's still one of the better independent survival horrors I've played to date. And largely because of these reasons. It's a simple, reliable, feel-good peanut butter sandwich of a video game, satiating a very specific type of craving, even if it does annoyingly stick to the roof of my mouth afterwards. And as a result, I think it would be the perfect introduction for anyone who is interested in, but perhaps a little hesitant about, survival horror games, for whatever reason that may be. And with a treasure trove of classic video game cheats, optional modes, and arguably too many difficulties, you can squeeze a lot of time out of this otherwise neat little 5-hour package. Though I highly recommend this game, I do not claim any responsibility should the puppets make you shit your pants. After a 6-year market onslaught, the current iteration of the Switch hardware is finally drawing to a close. And what better way to commemorate Nintendo's most profitable generation than by releasing a follow-up to the game that kickstarted it all? The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom directly follows the events of my 2017 Game of the Year, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, while directly building atop and iterating upon the literal foundation that it laid all those years ago. Breath of the Wild is, to the modern gaming landscape, what people claimed Ocarina of Time to be for the industry prior. And though we haven't yet constructed a Frankenstein's monster of genre terminology to brand this flavor of open-world sandbox, its influence is still as strong as ever. With games like Genshin Impact, Sonic Frontiers, Chia, Immortals Phoenix Rising, Crystal Project, and Elden Ring, there are so many breath-likes that the medium must be running the risk of hyperventilation. Breath of the Wild took Ubisoft's long-stale Tower Scouter foundation and chose to strip away all of the incessant quest HUD and map iconography. Instead of beating the player over the head with indicators and checklists, it meticulously places points of interest all across the world's horizon, tempting the player through their own innate wanderlust. Clearly, every nook and cranny has been painstakingly handcrafted and placed by thoughtful designers, though it's easy to convince one's emotional animal brain that he has instead been stumbling onto completely bespoke and undocumented scenarios. I wouldn't go as far to say that the world of Hyrule felt believable or even alive, so to speak, but rather to say that my curiosity always felt rewarded, if only through minor acknowledgement at worst. The same could be said for the game's super flexible and open-ended solutions to problem solving. The design philosophy is simply, if it works, it works. The idea that a flagship Zelda title would encourage the player to bend, twist, and break itself in every conceivable way sort of feels antithetical to Nintendo's iron-fisted, control-freakish nature, though from a creative perspective, there are few capable of matching the abundant playfulness of Nintendo's internal studios. They've always excelled at making games that feel like elaborate toys, and I mean that in the most complimentary way possible. And for the past 7 years, Breath of the Wild has been the exemplary toy box title in their catalog. So how do you follow that up? Well, if Breath of the Wild is the toy box, then Tears of the Kingdom is the entire toy factory, providing the player with every tool imaginable to fill the existing play space with whatever the hell their imagination can conjure up. Though this is an easy sell on paper, it does raise some concerns. Namely, how well are these new systems integrated into the pre-existing Breath of the Wild foundation? Does it feel like a natural evolution or a cannibalizing gimmick? Roughly 6 years have passed since the events of Breath of the Wild, and the Kingdom of Hyrule has become overrun by a tangible plague of darkness, dubbed the Gloom. The game begins with Zelda and Link exploring the depths beneath Hyrule Castle in search of the gloom's source. As they delve deeper, they stumble across remnants of an ancient Zonai tribe, of which Zelda assumes to be the founders of Hyrule's royal family. This context is imperative. Our heroes continue their descent, tracing the gloom's origin to a massive chasm beneath, wherein the mummified remains of none other than Ganondorf lay bound. Suspended in time and space, a disembodied arm reaches down into the abyss, sealing away the Demon King's life, almost as if it had drowned him in a sea of his own darkness. Coincidence ensues as the binding breaks. The corpse cracks, pops, and grinds in sounds of rigor mortis before jolting awake, fully reanimated. The Demon King lashes out at Zelda with a torrent of gloom, but Link intercepts, thrusting the Master Sword right into the crimson darkness. The gloom tears through Link's flesh and steel, crippling both the Master Sword and himself. It circles back with another charge. Link swings his sword down with all of his might. It shatters to pieces. With the Master Sword broken, the darkness cannot be sealed. The victorious Demon King then uproots Hyrule's castle, suspending it just beneath the clouds. The barriers that once separated sky from land from subterranean clearly broken. In all of the chaos, Zelda is kidnapped by a bright flash of light, and Link is left tumbling down into the abyss. He's eventually caught and pulled to safety by none other than the disembodied arm, which, as we are soon to find out, belongs to King Rauru of the Zonai. Now bearing the grafted arm of Rauru as well as the remnants of the Dark Sealing Sword, Link must travel between all 3 tiers of the kingdom in order to fulfill his lives-long duty to save the Princess Zelda and put Ganon back on ice. Those familiar with Breath of the Wild should remember the powers granted by the Sheikah Slate. These powers were used in everything from exploration to puzzle solving to combat, acting as the game's Swiss Army knife of systems. This concept remains in Tears of the Kingdom, though instead of downloading apps to a mystical tablet, Link will be channeling Zonai magic through the arm of King Rauru. These persistent reality-bending mechanics are so crucial to the moment-to-moment gameplay that I couldn't imagine starting our discussion anywhere else. Casting recall on a moving or recently moved object will rewind time for that object only, having it retrace its exact movement path up to a maximum of 30 seconds prior. Though recall's applications are a bit more broad, I used it primarily as a means to cross troublesome terrain. By using recall in conjunction with Ultra Hand, the player can draw out an item's flight path and then play it back. This is an excellent way to create makeshift elevators to scale walls, or even sliding platforms to clear chasms. It's also quite handy if you have a tendency to drop important items off of a ledge. I'll let you figure out the rest yourself. For my impatient friends with attention disorders, I've got the thrill ride of the century for you. Link's Ascend ability is quite literally a repurposed development tool that allows Link to target and phase through flat overhead surfaces and pop out through to the other side. And we're not just talking like thin platforms here. Link will actually travel the full length of any targeted object until reaching a destination large enough for him to exit automatically. He could, in theory, ascend from the bottom of a sea cavern straight to the peak of a mountaintop with a single button press. Completely depends on if the alignment is right. If this isn't the most fun you can have while pixel hunting, then I don't know what is. But hey, I hear you. YouTuber, none of these abilities are gonna quench my lust for blood. I got you, brother, calm down. Perhaps the most contentious aspect of Breath of the Wild was its incredibly low item durability, and by extension, lack of anything resembling a repair function. While I may have been on the correct side of history with my love for the system's brutality, I can also admit that a typical mob encounter probably shouldn't be burning up 2 weapons on average. Clearly something needed to change, but I was concerned that Nintendo might overcorrect. And hey, they didn't. They doubled down. It's said that when Ganon caused the upheaval, he commanded the Gloom to seek out and corrode all perceivable weapons in the kingdom so that no one would ever challenge him again. So not only do weapons found within the overworld break more easily than before, but they've also been dulled to a near unusable state. However, this is where the fusion ability comes into play. Through fusion, Link can meld all sorts of items onto pieces of equipment in order to strengthen and empower them. Think of the combo weapons from Dead Rising 2. And now stop, because they're really not like that at all. The process is as follows. You'll first want to mind your base weapon, as it will dictate the overall archetype of your makeshift weapon's design. Having a greatsword as a base, for example, means that you're going to be swinging wide and hitting hard, whereas a polearm for a base will provide a much greater reach and hit in rapid succession. You can then grab anything from nearby boulders, monster parts, and even other weapons and just jam them onto the end of your base weapon for free. Not only does this proportionately increase the weapon's overall durability and attack power, but it may also provide different properties unique to the item attached. For example, affixing a ruby onto a weapon will cause it to hurl fireballs with each swing, whereas doubling up on polearms will simply turn you into Sephiroth. Items can be similarly attached to shields, though the properties may vary to fit into more of a defensive role. To use the ruby example once more, attaching one to the end of your shield won't necessarily have any immediately apparent effects, though should an enemy strike at it, well, they might just be met with an explosive surprise. And it should go without saying, but items can also be attached to Link's arrows too, though this is limited to consumables and throwables, again like plants and monster parts, and directly replaces the stock arrow types from Breath of the Wild. It's a much welcome improvement, giving you access to a wider array of options at a greater frequency. Whew, okay, so Now you've got a pretty solid understanding of Link's tools. That means we can start talking about the game around them, and the many ways it encourages and incentivizes their use. Or doesn't. As we've discussed, this is the same Hyrule from Breath of the Wild, only 6 or so years in the future. Therefore, the kingdom's map and general layout have not actually changed, but due to the upheaval having perforated the land with chasms, the contents within the kingdom may have been displaced or outright ruined in some cases. Though to say that the surface world has been simply recycled, repainted, and reused would actually be pretty dishonest. The entire land has been completely repopulated with new enemy types, treasures, NPCs, quests, activities, and most importantly, new dungeons, which I actually want to take a pause to really hone in on. Dungeons now come in a variety of 3 distinct flavors. Totaling at 152 locations, shrines make their triumphant return from Breath of the Wild. Shrines are a collection of short, one-off micro-dungeons that test the player on a particular skill set. This can range from a simple combat encounter or even a building challenge to more traditional room-scale puzzles, the majority of which prioritize the player's solution over their process. Meaning that, as I said earlier, if it works, and nothing feels better than thinking you've cheated a shrine through sheer ingenuity alone, even if hundreds of playtesters had likely done it before you. If being whisked away into the framerate dimension to solve puzzles is not your speed, Tears of the Kingdom has also introduced, as Google has graciously informed me, a total of 147 cave structures for your spelunking needs. These seamless in-world junior dungeons are less about solving runic puzzles and more about fighting and climbing your way to the wondrous treasures stored within. They're simple, immersive, and a welcome change of visual pace when stumbled upon naturally. Though, like Korok seeds, I might advise against seeking each of them out lest environment fatigue claim yet another victim. What is worth seeking out in totality, however, are Tears of the Kingdom's e-ticket attractions. Gone are the long abhorred divine beasts from Breath of the Wild. Instead, players will venture out in search of the 5, arguably 7, traditional dungeons taking their place. In these bombastic set pieces, Link will join forces with his fellow guardians, or sages as they're called, to aid them on their personal quests to save their respective regions. In addition to being sizable tests of your accumulated game knowledge, these dungeons will also introduce the player to different sage abilities. Within their specified dungeons, these are the player's main puzzle-solving tools. The Wind Sage, for example, can use gusts of wind to activate distant turbines, and the Fire Sage can turn into Dylan's Rolling Western to barrel through stone. As is the case in Breath of the Wild, once their assigned temples have been completed, Link will inherit access to these abilities for the remainder of the game. And just like Breath of the Wild, again, their usefulness will vary. We'll come back to this. Hey, did you know that the kingdom is split into 3 separate tiers? God, I know it's crazy. Look, we've been talking around the specifics for this for a while now, so I think it's finally time to see what all of the fuss is about. The Sky Islands, though heavily pushed in the game's marketing, are actually shockingly thin. They don't have much of an identity outside of lending real estate to the awkward, literal gachapon machines for encapsulated building components. Truthfully, they feel like an expansion of the kingdom's surface, sharing a lot of the same objectives and activities, but with more of the emphasis being placed on how to traverse from one island to the next. Hey, I actually did research for this bit. In Volume 9 of Nintendo's Ask the Developer series, Tears of the Kingdom director Hidemaru Fujibayashi revealed that the number of Sky Islands was originally much larger before internal complaints caused them to scale back. Alright, now back to me. While I do agree that 3 maps of the same scope would have been too much, cutting content outright without any sort of substitution just kind of makes the Sky Islands feel like an afterthought compared to the other tiers, which again feels even worse when it's sort of the big advertising push. The depths have a lot more to offer in terms of unique content, such as battle arenas, Hylia statues, Poe collecting, and Yiga outposts, but the area itself is drab, daunting, and completely disorienting. They've effectively taken the surface map, mirrored it, put walls up everywhere, and then shut off all the lights. It doesn't provide the freedom of the sky nor the tantalizing horizon line of the surface. It's just a big room of darkness that's surrounded by even more darkness. Most of my time in the depths was spent breadcrumbing myself a trail of bright bloom seeds so I wouldn't get lost, and mashing my face against every cavernous wall for any path forward, and almost always finding empty space on the other side. I often felt clueless as to what my driving force in the depths even was, not to mention which way I was even meant to be going to find it. Though the rewards could be great when you eventually stumbled across them, I just never found the persistent aimlessness of the depths to be even remotely enjoyable. I can only assume that the idea was for the player to access the depths through different chasms on the surface as they played the game normally, but since the depths are coated in gloom, which, if you don't know, temporarily decreases your max health the longer you make contact with it, and this whole area is populated by some of the most aggressive monsters, I never felt well equipped for the actual challenge until I had pretty much already scraped the entirety of the surface. So asking me to go back, seek out different chasms, and kind of spot check them all for the right path forward just felt like additional busy work on top of an entire zone that was built out of busy work. With a little less obfuscation, the depths could have actually thrived as a higher difficulty zone, but as it stands, I want very little to do with it. Thankfully, the surface of Hyrule is still the main stage, and aside from a few specific narrative scenarios, you won't really be forced to deviate from that familiar path. But is that something that we should really be celebrating? I want to tell you a story about the time that I accidentally made Tears of the Kingdom a more cohesive experience. When the game finally gave me free reign of the map, it was clear that the expectation was for me to stroll up to the next outpost or town and start chatting up the locals. Only the game was actually, if anything, way too good at its job. Dozens of breadcrumby curiosities began to call out to me long before I could even orient myself within the open world. I would choose to let my attention disorder lead me astray. For the next 10 odd hours, I would navigate the surface of Hyrule in the most archaic way possible, without any access to the hang glider. I had sort of gotten the idea in my head that since the hang glider wasn't given to me in this game's version of the Great Plateau, that it must have been an unlock much later in the game. My justification for this logic was that since the game is about constructing bridges and vehicles, clearly the game would want me to interact with and utilize these new systems instead of just having me hang glide over large swaths of the world. And playing the game in this mentality was thrilling. It felt like a full realization of the survival elements of Breath of the Wild, especially coupled with the improved verticality and the decreased scalability of the upheaval geography. I have fond memories of cutting down trees with a dulled axe, trying to glue all of the trunks together to create a climbable surface that could be laid against things like icy cliff faces or buildings when it was raining. It was definitely finicky, but in like the most engaging way possible because it worked. I would also seek out any opportunity to build vehicles that I could. If I had a lot of flat ground to cover, you can bet that I had an ugly-ass wagon struggling to transport me a mile in any given direction. Couldn't even turn the damn things. If I even so much as glanced at a change in elevation, the wagon would practically kill itself on the spot. It was super frustrating, but it was even funnier. Anyway, I'd eventually find my way back to that initial outpost, and I would chat with those NPCs, and after a not-so-brief refresher course on the Ubisoft towers, they would end up just giving me the hang glider. Turns out it wasn't some in-game power-up like I thought or hoped that it would be. I was meant to have had it all along, and I knew that the monkey inside of me would not be willing to forego convenience for fun. As much as I love building these silly contraptions in Tears of the Kingdom, the process itself can be a lot of things. It can be restrictive, time-consuming, and honestly pretty risky. Even things that you would assume to be quite simple, like a car that you can steer, might be completely out of reach for dozens of hours, since you, 1, have to find all of the necessary components. I didn't find a steering contraption for almost 40 hours, by the way. And 2, you have to be willing to gamble away your limited resources on a vehicle that might not even end up being helpful to you. So when the game then offers you the accessibility and the reliability of something like the hang glider or riding horses, it feels like the choice is being made for you. To jump ahead to my main point, Tears of the Kingdom, like so many of these big budget games of today, it's doing too many things. The already varying quality of these individual aspects in a vacuum is then further exacerbated when forced into a shared space. I can appreciate wanting to spoil the player for choice, but when the options presented are not made equal, it instead spoils the choice. Tears of the Kingdom wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be a survival game, it wants to be an RPG, it wants to be a sandbox, it wants to be largely non-invasive, but it also wants to have a stronger narrative presence than its predecessor, which is a whole can of worms on its own. My favorite part of Breath of the Wild was how it presented the player with one main objective right at the start: defeat Ganon. You knew where he was, you knew how to get there, and you could choose to go there whenever you felt ready to tackle the challenge. The player controlled the pace of their entire experience. Tears of the Kingdom, on the other hand, has shifted the goal from defeat Ganon to find Zelda, meaning that the player is now at the mercy of the game, or at least their own deduction skills, which is pretty interchangeable as far as I'm concerned, as the expectation is for them to search for clues to piece together Zelda's whereabouts. The surface of Hyrule is littered with these massive dragon-shaped geoglyphs, and yes, I had to look up the terminology. Each geoglyph is a bastard's rendition of Where's Waldo, with the Waldo in question being a tear-shaped icon located somewhere on each of the dragons. When approached, the tear will manifest a Pensieve-esque puddle that reveals a segment of Zelda's story. The idea is that if you follow these chronologically, they should eventually lead you straight to Zelda's location. And it's important to note that these are completely optional and only exist to 1. Nudge the player forward, and 2. House the majority of the game's narrative cutscenes. Zelda is, in fact, completely accessible from the start, and while I won't reveal her location, I will say that I was not satisfied with this mystery's outcome. I instead feel like I was sent on a wild goose chase and asked to suffer through a dozen nothing cutscenes to have the video game just kind of point at something that I've been purposefully avoiding all game and go, hey, it was actually here all along. But this isn't even the only time that the game pulls something like this. The game tells you that the primary objective is to find Zelda, but that's technically not even true. It's secondary to the real win condition, which is to just go kill Ganon again. And where is he? Right where you fucking left him. So turns out it was actually like Breath of the Wild the entire time, but it just kind of lies to you and tells you that it's something different. Maybe I'm blowing this out of proportion, but I really hate when video games give me explicit instructions to do something and then treat me like some sort of villain when I don't instead use and follow my real-life human logic. By the time I would find this out, I was so exhausted, frazzled, and deflated that I couldn't even enjoy the entire march to the game's ending. I just sat there, sideways in a hotel cuck chair somewhere between South Carolina and Pennsylvania, vibrating with frustration as I made my final trudge through the depths. Aside from bricking my console or leaking sensitive information to the internet, wasting time is probably the most offensive thing a video game can do to me, and Tears of the Kingdom routinely found new and inventive ways to rob me of the sand in my half-full hourglass. Whether it was fighting with obtuse or outright hostile controls, watching the game grind to a slideshow every time Ultra Hand was activated, aimlessly wandering the map for hours in search of a crucial building component, or simply being foolish enough to take the game's directions at face value. Tears of the Kingdom is an incredible game that's attached to a series of equally novel concepts, but the lack of synergy between the two causes a self-cannibalizing effect, cheapening the impact of both. When viewed through the lens of a survival game or an RPG, I would say it's far superior to Breath of the Wild. It has addressed all of the complaints regarding weapon durability, enemy variety, and overall combat fatigue, and the inclusion of caves, wells, and traditional dungeons makes the physical world of Hyrule feel considerably more lived in, or at least like a place that could be lived in. But when viewed through the lens of a sandbox, the cracks really do start to show. The tools are rudimentary, the resources are a hassle, and even simple constructs are plagued by unreasonable limitations on these systems. As a result, it's typically just more efficient for the average player to rely on the abundance of non-creative tools the game has to offer. It's a game where I feel that pre-existing knowledge is almost necessary to have the best possible experience. But personally, I'll be damned if I'm going to replay any video game that's over 70 hours. In my incredibly short time as a painter, the most important lesson that I ever learned was to wash my brushes, but the second most important lesson that I learned was a slightly reskinned plagiarizing of the great Leonardo da Vinci. Quote, "A painting is never finished, it's merely abandoned at the most interesting point." An artist has to be willing to walk away from a piece while it still has integrity. Otherwise, they'll add, tweak, and iterate until there's nothing left but a confusing mess. I'm sure you understand where this is going. Anyway, seeing as I've made my piece, it's time to take my own twice plagiarized advice and move on to the next thing, while I still can. Sometimes being slow has its advantages. Due to the length of Baldur's Gate 3, I had long accepted the fact that I was not going to be able to play and complete it before the end of the year. Fortunately, however, making this video took just long enough for me to squeeze out a playthrough before wrapping on production. I'm sure I don't have to tell you how enormous Baldur's Gate 3 is. It's one of the most meaningfully dense and reactive games I've ever played. So much so that my single playthrough almost feels insufficient to cover the game to my own personal standard. It's very clear that all of my in-game decisions, from the role I chose to play to the company that I chose to keep, had led me down a personalized path wildly different from the ones not taken. Entire zones left uncharted, several core party members abandoned as bench warmers, corpses, or worse, strangers. And don't get me started on all of the unexplored character classes and builds. If I were to stop playing Baldur's Gate 3 now, it feels like stopping Sonic Adventure only having played the Sonic portions. That said, there's still plenty of valuable discussion to be had regarding my 100+ hour journey with Little Barry and his 3 dead wives. But for the sake of time and sanity alike, I just want to cover some of the biggest points of interest, both positive and negative, that I encountered during my time. First, to criticize Baldur's Gate 3 is to criticize Dungeons & Dragons, something that I have even less authority to talk about. I guess I've played D&D before, but in the way your little brother plays PlayStation with the controller unplugged. Telling me that Baldur's Gate 3 follows the rules and regulations of, quote, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition means about as much to me as someone explaining which version of Goku is on my TV screen. I don't know if I'd go as far to say that a basic understanding of D&D and 5e is necessary to play or even enjoy the game, but god damn, it surely prevent you from having to ask the question to begin with. I really struggled with adapting to D&D's nomenclature. Despite Larian's best efforts to provide keyword highlights and an in-game glossary, it's very clearly made with the expectation that you've been properly exposed to D&D and its terminology beforehand. For me, the scenarios ranged from, hey, this term's kind of vague, all the way to, wow, the term spell slot means something entirely different from every other video game I've ever played. And with the sheer volume of systems and text this game has, it's probably unreasonable to catch all of your misconceptions and misinterpretations early on. Hell, I streamed 70 of my 110 hours to a group of, I would say, D&D literate people, and they had to routinely stop and ponder in-game definitions. And Lord help me if I ever had to resort to the internet. Even when I did find myself largely acclimated to D&D's verbose verbiage, my mind still snagged on some of the more mechanical pen and paper holdovers. Most notably, I wish that you just had access to the entirety of your learned spells whilst outside of combat. If the only barrier preventing me from using a learned spell outside of combat is simply going into a menu to equip it, then it's really just busy work for the player, a la the Iron Boot switching in Ocarina's Water Temple. And the only reason it works this way, according to the Peanut Gallery, is because that's how it works in Dungeons & Dragons. The idea that Larian is not allowed to deviate too far from these now ancient textbooks, even to clarify or streamline a process that may benefit from it, that raises some red flags for me. But on the flip side, I do love that the concept of rolling the die has been physically represented in-game. It offers a tense, gambling-esque level of excitement that you just wouldn't get otherwise. But I feel like it's missing from combat scenarios. Of course, it would need to be automatic and non-invasive and part of the existing user interface, but I really wish that skill checks and saving throws in combat had some visual die components for the sake of clarity. I want to preface my next point by stating again that I did stream the overwhelming majority of this playthrough on Discord, so when I say that the game has really tested the limits of my mental stack, it's only fair to acknowledge the role that playing to and conversing with an audience may have had and such. But with trying to, and buckle up because I've got a few, trying to internalize this game's unique language, remembering to set my spell slots in between encounters, keeping up with my Mary Poppins bag of an inventory, casting my persistent long rest spells, monitoring my available actions, and remembering to check which spells are concentration before mistakenly overriding another, there's kind of just a lot going on at once. I am many things, but a multitasker is not one of them. Thank Christ the game's turn-based, or else we probably wouldn't even be here right now. Obviously, when walking into a game this size, you've got to adjust your expectations and your tolerance for bullshit. People are usually pretty quick to lambast Bethesda's first-party RPGs for their, admittedly, questionable release dates, but I do wonder where that same behavior was with Baldur's Gate 3, because I've had everything from persistent visual bugs and broken animations, laggy menus, suspiciously long action buffering windows, all the way to broken pathing, characters falling through the environment, inventory sorting that gets completely jacked up, quest soft locks that I had to restart to fix, and not to mention that one weird time that my entire inventory turned into drums for some reason. I mean, for reference, I finished Cyberpunk 2077 and its DLC within the same month as Baldur's Gate, and these games were breaking at a fairly even pace. And while some hiccups were genuinely really funny and pretty good for the stream environment, others were nearly ruinous to the entire playthrough and had forced me to retread hours collectively. For as polished as the game felt in some aspects, it was jarring to see it implode in ways that I feel like should have been easily caught during the extended early access period. The same could be said for the game's variable quality of life, which teeters from such admirable inclusions as the extreme ease of access to the player's camp and the game's immaculate, arguably optimal, controller support, only for all of that to be upended by, again, another list, the lack of in-combat action and movement confirmations, lack of a movement override function so that you can force your entire party to move through difficult or dangerous terrain, no option to select which character will start an unprompted conversation, and the game having some of the worst inventory organization systems I've ever seen in my life. Had the actual video game been anything less than fucking incredible, I would not have been able to tolerate the relentless, month-long barrage of nonsense that it threw at me. But I did. There were times that I genuinely could not pull myself away from Baldur's Gate 3. There were times where I caught myself saying things like, I can't wait to try this differently on my next playthrough. That ain't like me, man. Out of the countless fleeting video game zeitgeists I've been subject to in my 2 decades of being dialed in, finally, I understand some hubbub. You're given so many options to create your perfect avatar right from the start. Any fetishizable feature one could feasibly fawn over, from elf ears, hellish horns, lizard lickers, and gnome grippers, are represented, with male, female, and non-binary variations to choose. Though, note of caution to those who prefer to min-max every scrutable detail, be mindful of your racial attributes, as all sorts of innate stats, abilities, cantrips, and spells can vary depending on your selected race. Or you could just make your little guy blue, because it's funny, and watch as several NPCs short-circuit trying to come up with an original slur to call you. The Final Fantasy V stan in me is especially excited about all of the class and subclass options available right from the start. Everything from Oath-Kept and Oblivion Paladins, Angry Sword Wielder 1 and 2, and my personal favorite, 3 different flavors of spellcasters, of which I genuinely can't tell apart without outside help. Best of all, you can incestuously mix, match, and multi-class to your heart's content. If you want to put each of your 12 levels into a totally different job, no one's going to wag their finger at you. In synergy with the game's long list of available feats and excellent equipment system, there's no shortage of interesting builds and compositions to experiment with. Oh, and lest we forget, all of this applies to your party members too. Go beat the game with 4 clerics and relive the Final Fantasy I legend. While we're at it, a round of applause for this game's surprisingly endearing cast of characters. This is the most JRPG a CRPG cast has probably ever been. You could even say that Shadowheart and Karlach are the new Tifa and Aerith of a new generation. I mean, I wouldn't, seeing as Tifa and Aerith have become the themselves of a new generation, but I wouldn't make fun of you for saying it. Sure, there are a few stinkers, and yeah, maybe I did end up having to put a few of them down, but that's besides the point. Everyone's gotta have a Kate Sith, after all. We just leave them in the camp and pretend they don't exist. Though it's nice to see that someone has finally made an I can fix them simulator that does indeed allow those determined enough to fix any problematic behavior of your party members. I only wish that I would have known that going in before I fed into the hot girl's delusions for brownie points. Maybe then I wouldn't have had to pay for sex. As excited as I am to play with all of the tools I missed on my first go, I'm arguably more excited to hang out with the characters that I left behind. I'm thankful that the game is crafted in such a way where I can gobble up all my crucial party members within mere moments of starting a run, a long-standing RPG pet peeve of mine finally remedied. In fact, I'm quite pleased with the game's pacing overall. Aside from the shotgun blast content dump of the game's third act, choosing to clean up as many of the optional quests as available mostly does not grind the game to a halt. And even when you do inevitably come face to face with quest fatigue, I've seen the game's critical path be completed in less than 10 hours. You can just choose to hit any given axe version of Zelda's castle and get on with your life. Larian's not going to waste your time unless that's specifically what you ask them to do. Speaking of the critical path, I suppose I should briefly touch on the core narrative. Basically, you've got a worm in your brain. So do your friends. You have to ask yourself, do you like the worm? Do you want to become a beautiful butterfly in conjunction with the worm? Or do you wish to tour the realm in search of a cure potent enough to remove the worm? It's a straightforward, great power, great responsibility, but only if you want to plot. That's mostly a container for the cornucopious character stories within. As I said in the beginning, I can't vouch for every possible path through the main campaign, but the presence of all of these meaningful and transformative options by themselves deserves a lot of credit. I rarely, if ever, felt restricted to a certain path out of plot necessity. If I didn't like something, I could pretty much choose to ignore it, invalidate it, or remove it from the game completely. If I didn't care for a specific chapter or story arc, I could tie that into my character's in-universe decision-making and still enjoy the ramifications of whatever actions may follow. I mean, you even have an option to hit credits in Act 2 if you want. Baldur's Gate 3 is an excellent playground with some really special characters, but had I not been invested in the roleplay component or been accepting of the hilarious consequences, I don't know that I'd harbor the same kind of strange adoration for the game. I feel like my favorite moments were either things that I had projected onto the game or scenarios where the game completely broke on me and I was able to turn that into content. I could argue that I made a lot of my own fun, but I suppose that's what a legitimate role-playing game is literally meant to do, right? Besides, it'd be awfully reductive given how much Larian had set me up for such success by making a game that is so reactive and hands-off to begin with. The game may literally crumble beneath its own weight at a frequency not unlike its more notorious contemporaries, but I do believe that your tolerance will be rewarded in full. Just maybe don't approach it from an ultra-serious completionism perspective. Keep your saves frequent in case of catastrophe, but perhaps do yourself the favor of rolling with the punches as often as you can. The game is far more interesting that way. Just make sure you have your D&D Bible and a gamepad close by. You're gonna need them. I wrote about my house for days. Words continued to pile up on my screen, but they never actually led me anywhere. I felt like I was spinning in circles, and the motion just began to nauseate me, which, funnily enough, felt appropriate in the context of my house, as it too spun me in circles. I found myself completely consumed by the map. I played it for hours, frantically searching for something that I hadn't previously seen. Something that would satiate the quenchless curiosity that I had. I read forum post after forum post, went from YouTube video after YouTube video, and even dabbled in playing around with map editing myself, just trying to fill this weird gaping hole in my stomach. It felt like I'd been possessed by the malevolent spirit that tormented the map's fictitious author, but all my attempts to exorcise it really only strengthened its grip on me. Despite my best attempts, I can't articulate why my house makes me feel so vulnerable. I know all of its tricks, yet I still feel powerless to it. I know the story is fiction, but I can't shake this overwhelming feeling of genuine sadness that pours out of it. I've heard mention of the developer's real-life divorce, and if that's true, maybe that's the grief that I'm sensing. Even just writing about it over the last couple of days has had significant vampiric effects on my energy, and failing to find the right words to convey how romantically harrowing this map is, it definitely doesn't help. Though I suppose all I can really do now at this point is kill my darlings and hope that speaking plainly will suffice. MyHouse, or MyHouse.wad, is a free community-made Doom 2 mod built for GZ Doom, though it would be more appropriate to call it an entirely new game within the GZ Doom engine. Unlike the Salacos or the Vomitoriums of the world, this isn't a reskinned romp to showcase Doom's imperishable combat loop. Instead, what began as a deceptive, cooperative, community-wide puzzle has now settled into a manipulative, cross-media experience that more closely resembles one's pursuit of a visual novel's canonical ending. Like Alan Wake himself, the player must write draft after draft, utilizing the information gleaned from previous failed attempts in order to carve the critical path out of this psychological nightmare. For every bit of my house that is palpably Doom, it's always teetering on the edge of disparity. It both did not have to be Doom, but it also couldn't have been anything else. It thrives off of the subverted expectations of what Doom is believed to be and to be capable of, but it does not depend on it in order to succeed. And its entire narrative hinges on Doom's real-world societal significance, while actively reinforcing Doom's own eternal legacy. Talking about my house feels like trying to describe a color or an emotion to someone. Until they've experienced it firsthand, it'll just remain outside of the realm of comprehension, no matter how many words that I use. I could easily chronicle my own playthrough step by step, word for word, but there isn't a collection of scrutable systems and mechanics to break down and compare as normal. Not in the traditional sense, anyway. It's more about how you react to and interact with the ever-changing world, and revealing those details would only ensure a cheapened experience for anyone who wants to play the map for themselves. And the map deserves more than that, frankly. While I definitely have some feelings on how the real-world plot elements were handled, I feel like I'd have to become the weeds in order to even set up that topic. Hopefully I'll find an appropriate avenue to share those thoughts at a later time, but I would rather take this time to encourage you to play it for yourself, assuming you haven't already. If you're a fan of psychological horror, liminal or impossible space, creepypastas, ARGs, or obviously just Doom, I think this could prove to be an unforgettable experience, and it doesn't cost anything. Alternatively, I would even point you towards PowerPack's incredibly comprehensive chronological video essay, as they do a fantastic job of emulating and illustrating an authentic first-time experience with provided invaluable insight that you surely wouldn't have gotten from me. For my money, this is the closest one can get, just short of getting hands-on with the map themselves. It's also just really good content on its own. All those things I said in the beginning are true. My House left me feeling gutted in a way that I haven't probably since I completed Omori. It lingers in a weird part of my mind where it physically weighs me down. But not because it's scary or traumatic necessarily, but rather because of how well it fabricates a sense of nostalgia for a time and a place that I didn't participate in. It's like waking up from a dream where you've lived an entirely different life, loved entirely different people. It can also feel like breaking into a stranger's subconscious and rummaging around in all of their disjointed memories. It's invasive both ways. And I can understand if facing complex or uncomfortable emotions isn't necessarily a selling point for someone, though maybe the severity at which it has impacted me is more of a fringe case. One man's pool of self-reflection is another man's corny doom wad, after all. Like I said, I don't really understand why it has resonated so strongly with me. Maybe it came at the right time in my life. Maybe players get as much out of the map as they project onto it. Or maybe it really just is haunted, not by a malevolent spirit or anything per se, but rather the uninhibited grief of a real-life living human being. But we'll probably never know the deal behind My House, and nor do we need to. The monster is always better left unexplained after all. All that matters is the experience you have with it, and that we all acknowledge just how fucking cool of a project this thing really is. I've brought with me today some of my own words, of which I must gorge myself publicly like some sort of perverse mukbang. When it was first announced that Capcom's then next remake in the Resident Evil series would be none other than Resident Evil 4, it was met with a collective sigh that could be heard across the world. Many, myself included, went on to rant about how Resident Evil 4 had already been ported to every conceivable platform, some of which even boasting their own minor quality of life adjustments to contemporize RE4 to the standards of yesterday's today, with titles such as Resident Evil Code Veronica, or even the Resident Evil Outbreak subseries, practically begging someone to breathe new life into them, receiving instead a remake of a fully functional, widely available video game all-star raises as many questions as it does concerns. Even if your heart was open to the idea of a faithful remake of Resident Evil 4, consumer confidence wasn't particularly high for Capcom around this time. Through the likes of M2, Capcom had shat out and abandoned a severely disappointing, some would say outright offensive, remake for Resident Evil 3. It seemed like a clear indicator that the priority was not to restructure and repair the chronology of Resident Evil, but rather to rush straight to the cash cows and see if they can squeeze another 13 million units out of Resident Evil 5. As you can imagine, my response to the RE4 announcement was pretty harsh, and in retrospect, pretty misguided. I had made a knee-jerk declaration on Twitter that, quote, no remixing of RE4's events would be interesting enough to warrant a remake, end quote, which is a bizarre thing to say. I suppose my rose-tinted recollection had conveniently removed Del Lago, U3, and the entirety of the island from my brain. RE4 was never a game without faults. I think most people, myself included, just got used to them. I think a more honest and reasonable version of that tweet could have been how I couldn't point to many areas where a sizable change felt necessary. And since this remake wouldn't be a shift in genre or the camera's perspective, or the first time this game would be rendered out in full 3D like was the case for Resident Evil 2, it was hard to visualize aspects where the RE4 remake would justify itself, especially given the fact that, as stated, the original had been modernized and holds up tremendously well by today's standards. But like I said, I'm here to eat my own words. I'm now on the other side of the Resident Evil 4 remake, and I think maybe I did want this all along. I just didn't know it yet. I think Capcom has shown remarkable restraint in choosing to elevate the original game rather than making some uncanny caricature of it. It doesn't attempt anything that I'd consider to be an extreme deviation from the structure that you're already familiar with, but rather, it takes moments that may have overstayed or underperformed and either chooses to remix, replace, or relocate them to fit more cohesively with the rest of the game. Whether that's trading the Island's Bulldozer segment for Ashley's Wrecking Ball, or shifting the entire U3 fight over to separate ways, just to name a few. In the few situations where content has been outright removed, I don't even think most people would notice. It's very inconsequential stuff, like the cable car section in the village, or the lava room in the castle. I'm sure every room has its die-hard fans somewhere, but knowing that the time that could have been wasted on recreating the Salazar statue instead went to redressing Ashley's playable castle section to feel much more oppressive and terrifying, or expanding the village lake to function as an explorable micro-open world, I think that's a hell of a trade. Even narratively speaking, the team has shown a ton of respect to the original story. As far as I've been able to tell, things have only been expanded upon and further fleshed out, though not in a pad and filler kind of way. Ashley has probably undergone the most radical transformation, becoming a more endearing and capable character in place of the nasally damsel she once was. Her and Leon's relationship now also feels existent, gradually and palpably solidifying as they spend more time in each other's company. Leon has maintained his iconic dead-eyed, quippy attitude, though manages to offer a bit more of an emotional range this go. Luis trades a smidge of his sleazebag energy for considerably more screen time than before, making him feel more like a permanent fixture in this story. Ada is still Ada, and Krauser, I guess there was some attempt made to better establish his and Leon's relationship before his otherwise sudden appearance. The characters, the fidelity, color palette, voice acting, cinematography, everything has just been improved across the board, and all in all, I've got no notes. Gameplay, though, is where things start to really change up. For the most part, you'll see attention directed to the game's quality of life with the clearer gym inlay system or the map highlighted collectibles, alongside the ability to deposit your weapons into your typewriter's storage box. It's the little things that actually do make a huge difference. Resident Evil 4 Remake has also taken a few notes from the previous Resident Evil remakes. As a byproduct of receiving a standardized control scheme, Leon can now aim, shoot, and reload whilst on the move. Resource crafting as well as knife durability have also made their way over from past entries too. Knife durability makes a bit more sense in the context of the remake, as they've juiced its combat applications to the absolute max. Leon can now use any knife to execute staggered, downed, or transforming enemies at the cost of a hefty portion of the knife's durability gauge. Furthermore, Leon can ready his knife before being stricken by an enemy to parry the attack. This works for pretty much anything save grabs and explosions. It too costs a gnarly amount of gauge to perform, but better that than your health. Besides, you'll always be able to repair your combat knife at the stranger's shop. Of course, enemies have been adjusted appropriately to compensate for Leon's dramatic power spike. I'm not going to pretend I did ample research to cite anything other than my own ass as a source, but enemies seem much more numerous, moderately more durable, and maybe slightly more aggro than before. Resident Evil 4 Remake does have a total of 4 difficulties. Starting with Assisted, the game will keep auto-aim active by default, as well as provide more crafted ammo and an auto-heal for Leon whilst in a critical state. Standard, as the name suggests, is the recommended option, nothing really to note there. Hardcore, however, is listed as the option to choose if you have previous RE4 experience, though that's a bit misleading because this shit is hard. Enemies are significantly faster, stronger, and more durable than their standard iterations in the remake, and some items in the shop have even seen their prices increased. Professional has returned, but it isn't actually tuned any different from Hardcore's parameters. Instead, it removes autosaves and limits parries to perfect parries exclusively, though all weapon modifications will be available from the start. In conjunction with difficulty, your mileage may vary depending on your preferred input device. I originally played the game on PlayStation 5 and struggled on and off with how sluggish it felt on gamepad. I was never able to confirm outright if this was another PlayStation 5 input latency issue, or if I just routinely failed to find the quote, make this feel good on controller option within the game's setting. But it was enough of a nuisance to force me to buy and replay the entire game on PC for the sake of comparison. Thankfully, things felt as they should on keyboard and mouse, with the exception of the game's unwelcome QTEs. I expressly remember Capcom getting ahead of release to say, oh, the QTEs are antiquated, we took those things out, and I guess that only applied to cutscenes because the in-game defensive QTEs are still very much present here. Given that the game has full 3D movement, a functional crouch, and a parry system, I fail to see why we couldn't just encourage the player to utilize these other functions instead. Some things should absolutely stay in 2005, that's all I'm saying. I've been asked whether the remake invalidates or replaces the original game, and to the remake's credit, I've had to sit on that question for a good amount of time to come up with an answer that feels remotely satisfying. I think that structurally, narratively, visually, yeah, I think the remake is pretty easily superior. However, I think that Leon's more realistic movement comes at the cost of some of the precision and the control. Like, it's completely functional, don't get me wrong, it's just not as snappy as it was in the 2005 version. The original just has that crunchy, arcadey feel that the remake doesn't perfectly emulate, because it's not trying to. And on that merit alone, I think I can view the remake as more of a companion piece rather than an outright replacement. Though I do suspect that, on average, I'll be revisiting the remake much more often myself. Though if you're coming into the remake with no prior RE4 experience, this is all you really need. As far as new players are concerned, this is absolutely a replacement. Resident Evil 4 has maintained its long-running zeitgeist as a result of its innovative and highly addicting gameplay loop, brisk pacing, and memorable level design, aspects that, fortunately, have been unhindered by the changes made in the remake. Every 10 minutes or so, you're likely to stumble into a room that permanently brands itself onto your brain forever. Rooms that nearly become characters themselves. Even if you hate stealthing around the castle as Ashley or fumbling with keycards in the regenerator lab, set pieces don't last long enough to overstay their welcome. I still carry complicated, conflicting feelings around this remake series and Capcom's priorities with such, and there's a part of me that would have liked to see a remake more in line with the coveted Hookman demo, but I can't deny that the game in front of me is excellent and highly respectful and better than its source material in many different ways. And that's just not something you see in any entertainment medium often enough. Now, having chugged the Kool-Aid, I'm stoked for both RE5 and hopefully RE6 to make their remake debuts. Lord knows that I don't have any rose-colored bias towards those games, and I would actually just be very eager for outright replacements. I only hope that Capcom carries their current momentum forward and doesn't cheap out when it counts. And hopefully, when all is said and done, we can finally give Code Veronica the attention it deserves. Actually, just rewrite history and make the Code Veronica remake Resident Evil 3. I would LOL really hard. Whew, that was a lot of video games. But hey, you and me, we made it to the end, together. That means we're practically married now. So why don't you help me consummate this marriage by simply subscribing to my channel? I promise you won't want to miss what's coming up. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. I still have to answer a paraphrased version of the question I posed like 6 hours ago. Is 2023 the Jesus of video games? Probably, yeah. I mean, it's definitely at the Last Supper. 2023 feels like the true sequel to 2017. A metric shitload of well-known, long-anticipated, and generally well-reviewing games, but fewer that really resonate with me on a personal level. But that's okay, I'm not going to get a Kingdom Hearts or a Neon White every single year. My old heart probably couldn't take it anyway. But still, I'd be a fool to argue that the year was anything other than incredible. Cosmically speaking, it absolutely earns the right to be the Lady Tsunade of our Hokage rock. I actually had to Google what Naruto's Hokage monument was called. It really deadass gonna be called Hokage Rock. I guess I really shouldn't have expected anything different from the man who brought you Boruto. Anyway, that's all I really got for you. Had I managed to finish this on time, I'd probably be sitting here writing a touching and hopeful epilogue about the current video game renaissance and how it's likely to persist well into the coming years, but I'm writing this final segment in August of 2024, brother. Things are not looking too hot right now. I do want to give a heartfelt thank you to anyone and everyone out there making and contributing to games, even tangentially. I know it hasn't been fucking easy, what with the pandemic and the ongoing consequences of such, but despite that, or in spite of that, we've seen some of the greatest games and games coverage in my lifetime over these last few years. Seeing this medium thrive is the most important thing in the world to me, as silly as it sounds. I know things kind of suck right now for the creatives, for the critics, and for the consumers alike, but I know we're gonna put shit back in place, one union at a time. This medium is not going anywhere.